Okay, so welcome back, everybody. I can see people coming back in after lunch. So I'm hopefully you all had a nice break. We were at just over the 500 actual attendee mark. As I said, we have over 800 registered for the event. So there will be people popping in and out during the day, as many people are busy at work as well. So we're delighted for you to join us at any point. We do have a packed afternoon, so hopefully you've managed to get a little break there. As I say, we're going to open the next session in just one moment, but just to let you know that we are on Twitter under the hashtag Disclosure Seminar hashtag, and I believe we're trending now, whatever that means for us. I'm not too sure, but it means there's some traction and people are talking about it. So that's the main purpose of today, is to get this sort of thinking about facilitating, encouraging and supporting disclosure and bringing it to the fore and getting different views and perspectives on that. We're going to make the recording. It's going to be available in these various sections online at a later date, most likely next week. I will need some technical support with that, so I won't be doing it myself. So that will hopefully be available next week, and I will be able to link back in with those who have registered for the conference via your registration details. So I will make sure you all have the link. With that will be a link to the report that was launched today and a link to any materials that the presenters over the course of the day choose to share and make public, and I'm happy to facilitate that as well. Again, I just want to thank our funders for today, which are the Irish Research Council, New Foundations Grant and UCD Seed funding, without which I suppose we wouldn't be able to keep doing what we're doing. And it's very gratefully received. So they funded not just the event today, which was planned to be face-to-face and in person, and unfortunately we can't be. We had to plan in the context of COVID, and so we're online. But also funded the publication and the development of the research that has been published today. So I'm going to move us on to our next session. I hope you found this morning's session really worthwhile. I know I did, and as I said, when that video is available, I'll be going back over it myself. There's a lot of food for thought, and maybe just to take some time to pull out the various threads of that. And how we can look at developing systems that'll help people come forward, but help them when they have, and also wrap around in terms of support and facilitating that sort of that sense of wanting people to come forward, and that sense of developing an environment that encourages that when that person is ready and at that stage, and meeting that person where they're at. So I think we've got a nice thread of that through the speakers this morning, hopefully a little bit from my own research. And what we're moving into now is the voices from experience. And we're really delighted to be joined by two very inspiring speakers. And I say that because I have been at many of their talks over the years, and I've engaged with them at different levels. And I'm delighted they have opted to be on board with us today. We're going to be joined by Hazel, who I'll introduce now in one moment, and also Mick Finnegan, who will be, I see him online here, and he's going to join us after Hazel's presentation. So I'll introduce Mick in just a moment after Hazel's piece. But just to explain for any of you who don't know Hazel, and I would imagine there is a large amount of the 400 that are on now at the moment who do know Hazel. As I said, I've been at many of the functions that Hazel has spoken at, and she speaks about her experiences, but there is this thread of humanity going through it all, and it makes her advocacy such an authentic form of advocacy, in that it's for people. She's using her own experiences to help people. And she does this in her training, I know, which you might speak a little bit about yourself, Hazel. She does this in her advocacy work, as I'm saying, but she's also bringing this into her research as well, and she's a current PhD candidate at Dublin City University. So Hazel is a survivor of child sexual abuse, incest, trafficking, and intimate personal violence. She's doctoral candidate at Dublin City University, where her area of research is transgenerational trauma regarding women and child sexual abuse. Hazel has a background in theatre and holds degrees in psychology, sociology, sexuality studies, and law. Hazel has designed and runs training for professionals interested in trauma-informed practice in Ireland and internationally. In addition, she has created and runs courses for parents who were sexually abused as children, daughters of narcissistic mothers, and parents of sexually abused children. She also provides specialised doula care to women with histories of child sexual abuse. Hazel is involved with the Public Will campaign, a collaboration between Traverse Bay Child Abuse Centre and Michigan State University to end child sexual abuse. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Hazel now. Thank you, Hazel, for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really nervous, but apparently that's a good sign because it means that this matters. And of course it does. I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully. And I just wanted to say that I normally start my talks by advising people that I come with a trigger warning. I've refined that recently and said that I come with a self-care warning. So the self-care warning today is that I will be talking about child sexual abuse. I will be talking about the abuse of a minor. I will be talking about self-harm. And I also have one or two photographs that depict self-harm on a child's arm. They are graphic, but I'm sharing them because they are graphic. And I think that we need to be aware of what we're talking about when we're talking about self-harm. I'm all for naming things and not being euphemistic, as we tend to be in Ireland. So that is part of the reason that I'm sharing the photographs. A photograph speaks 1,000 words. And I will give a warning, obviously, before that slide is flashed up. Also, in terms of your self-care consideration, if this all gets too much, if I get too much, which has been known to happen, mute me, take yourself out of the space, do what you need to do to look after yourself. Please don't think that you need to force yourself through this in order to bear witness right this second. As we're aware, Joe will be providing these talks online at a later stage. So if this is something that you might want to come back to because you don't have the spoons or the mental or emotional bandwidth today, this is always something that you can come back to. Right, the clock is ticking. I need to get going. The title of my paper is Provocative and Deliberately So, How Rape is Legal in Ireland. In about 20 minutes, I hope that you'll see why it is that I'm saying that. The overall theme of this conference, as you know, is disclosure, and disclosure is key to accessing care, mental and physical, for victims, but disclosure is also essential to accessing the justice system. In recent times, Ireland has been lauded for its progressive legislation around coercive control. There we are, the Domestic Violence Act of 2018, and also the Harassment, Harmful Communications and Related Offences Act of 2020, which becomes relevant later on in this paper. Laws are completely useless, however, if they're not enforced. And I would remind you that the law prohibiting rape in marriage only came into effect in 1990. There it is. And I would also like to remind you that to date, there has only been one conviction under this law in 2002, when a man was found guilty of raping his wife just days after she had given birth. Now, it is nearly 30 years since I wandered into my local Garda station and said that I would like to make a statement and press charges against my father and my two elder brothers. In spite of written confessions and statements, the DPP decided not to prosecute. Time moves on, I got older, and in 2016, a young girl aged between 13 and 14 at the time was raped by 4 boys over the course of a number of months. Everyone involved was under the age of 18, although the boys were older than the girl, and she was raped orally, digitally, and vaginally. There was also an attempt to rape her anally. She was choked almost to the point of unconsciousness, and photographs were taken of her despite her pleading that they not be. These images were then disseminated online when this child confided in her mother a few months after the initial episode, and she immediately engaged with the Gardaí in an attempt to seek justice. The bravery required to sit with her mother in a room with strangers one of whom was a male detective, to discuss her sexual assaults cannot be underestimated. In total, this child met with Gardaí a total of 4 times. In fairness to them, the Gardaí were excellent. Their kindness, compassion, and understanding were in evidence every step of the way. Before the child had even finished giving her initial statement, the detectives told her that they believed her. And those 3 simple words, "I believe you," have made a significant difference to her recovery in a positive way. And I think, just as an aside, this paper, I think, ties up very nicely with what Dr. Michelle Walsh was saying earlier about the fact that behind every statistic, behind every complaint, there is a person. And in this case, as with Michelle's research, it's a young person, it's a group of young people that we're talking about. But over the following months, the Gardaí pursued Snapchat, Facebook, and WhatsApp in the US because, contrary to what children or people believe, Snapchat photos don't disappear. So they were pursued in the US to retrieve images that had been shared. The Gardaí supported the child victim and spoke to the named perpetrators. Crucially, not one of the boys denied the allegations, although one who has dual citizenship, on the advice of his lawyer, fled to New York. The JLO, that's the junior liaison officer, had deemed the case too serious to offer the young men the opportunity to take part in the youth diversion program. So after several months, the file was prepared for the DPP with a strong recommendation from the station sergeant to pursue a prosecution, and the DPP refused. So that's the background. And what I want to detail here is basically one victim's journey through the judicial system. What I have here is the response from the DPP's office, which I have been given permission to share. Identifying features have been redacted, of course, and how and why that contributes to rape being effectively, practically legal in Ireland. So in 2016, I was contacted by the family that I referred to because they needed support, and providing support is one of the things that I do in my professional life. Naively, I thought that Ireland, or more specifically her laws around sexual abuse and rape, had moved forward. I thought and I hoped that the new laws around rape, sexual assault, and IBSA, that's internet-based sexual assault, would ensure that this child would find justice. Unfortunately, I was wrong, and she didn't. Unfortunately, this girl and others like her just simply don't seem to be valued by the Irish judicial system. As I mentioned earlier, the DPP refused to prosecute perpetrators in this case. Now, since November 2015, it's possible to query the DPP's decision by filling out a form. So this victim did. And this was the response from the DPP. I'm just going to share my screen again. I say that like I know what I'm doing, but there we are. Excuse me, that is, there we are. Yes, this was the response from the DPP's office. It's a very nice bog standard letter acknowledging receipt of the request and assuring the victim that the case would be reviewed. A month later, the young woman in question received this letter, bearing in mind she's now 18, so is undertaking her own correspondence with the DPP, although she was 13 at the time of the first offence and 14 at the time of the last offence. So this is, again, just to say it's a holding letter, basically. We're working on it. We'll get back to you. Now, so a month later, she received this letter from the DPP's office. And I'd like to draw your eye first to the, there we are, to the highlighted part in pink, which I really hope you can see, but if you can't, I shall read it. It says the guidelines for prosecutors require that a decision to prosecute is based on the evidence available and an assessment of the public interest. It was decided in this instance that a prosecution was not in the public interest. And it goes on to say that even though there may be enough evidence to justify a prosecution, it does not mean that a case will automatically be prosecuted. We must also be satisfied that it is in the public interest to prosecute. Are you connecting the dots here the way I am? That the DPP is essentially saying it's not in the public interest to prosecute confessed rapists. I'm getting slightly annoyed. I hope you are too. When they make up their minds, the DPP also considers things like the interest of the victim, the suspect, and the wider community. the age and personal circumstances of the victim and the suspect, and the impact on the victim and the effect of a prosecution on the suspect, or on the suspects, as it is in this case, and the victim. It is possible now to request a review of the decision not to prosecute, which this young woman, who I have to say has a backbone of absolute steel, did. And she sent off her letter requesting the review. And in the November, bearing in mind we're looking at June for this letter, the following November, she got this response. Again, I will draw your eye to the highlighted pieces there. It says, there has been a review carried out of the original request, and they recap what they're looking for when they make a decision to prosecute. And it says here that in a criminal trial, a judge will instruct the jury that they must be satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused did what we, the prosecution, say they did. And I would have thought, there, forgive my naivety, that a written statement corroborating the victim's versions of events would satisfy that requirement. It is up to the prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he did, or in this case, that they did it. And again, written testimony from the rapists themselves to say that their version of events is not significantly different from that of the victim doesn't seem to satisfy this requirement. So the accused does not have to prove his innocence. He just has to prove that he is not guilty, which is a slight and nuanced difference in law. And finally, the jury has to have a reasonable doubt. If the jury has a reasonable doubt about guilt, they must acquit. They have no choice. And I think we all understand that one. I think we all understand that at this stage, with the amount of high-profile rape cases that we've had on this island in recent years, that the bar is very high in criminal cases, and it's very difficult to prove. But you know what goes a long way towards that? You've got it. Signed written confessions from the accused, who I must say, because I didn't say it earlier, they were interviewed with their legal guardians present, and they were entitled to legal advice, which they were also aware of and which they made use of. And there needs to be a reasonable prospect of conviction. Again, I will remind you that we have signed admissions of guilt from 3 of the 4 accused. So a decision to prosecute is based on the evidence available, is what this letter goes on to say, and an assessment of the public interest. So the evidence available is the evidence from the child herself, from the boys who are now young men who committed these offences, from the victim's therapists, from her family, from me, who saw the state of everybody at the time, from her plastic surgeon who performed the corrective surgery after her self-harm. And, you know, we could provide an army of people who could provide evidence and also, lest I forget, the signed sworn statements of admission by the teenagers who committed the offences. And an assessment, again, I'm referring to this letter highlighted there in pink, which you may or may not be able to see, an assessment of public interest. Yet again, we are reminded of the public interest. Yet again, we are reminded that prosecuting self-confessed rapists is not in the best interest of the public in the Republic of Ireland. I'm not making this up. The decision not to prosecute was made in accordance with our guidelines for prosecutors. The DPP had regard to the ages of all concerned and the potential effect a trial might have on you. So the Director of Public Prosecutions decided that the decision not to prosecute on public interest grounds was correct and should stand. You will note that it's nothing to do with evidence, nothing to do with the fact that the case might fall for lack of evidence. Purely, the DPP is standing, her position is that it is not in the public interest to prosecute. The guidelines stated that a prosecution should not be taken unless there is an admissible, substantial, and reliable evidence that a criminal offence has been committed by the suspect or suspects. Again, in case you've forgotten, let me just remind you that we have signed sworn statements of guilt from these young men, were provided to the Gardaí, formed part of the file that was subsequently forwarded to the DPP. And finally, in case we had forgotten, an assessment of the public interest must be undertaken before a prosecution can be made. That is the final point there. Now, the victim was not satisfied with this response, and you can probably tell from my demeanour, I wasn't particularly satisfied with it either. Did I mention that she's a really brave young woman? I have huge admiration for her. And in November of 2020, she wrote a letter back in response. And she told the victim liaison officer, who's the person who had written to her, that she disagreed with him, and she outlined why, and this is her letter. There has been a review, she highlights that there are 7 grounds taken into account when the officer decides not to prosecute. And these are, as I've drawn a box around them there, the seriousness of the crime, the impact on the victim, the age and personal circumstances of the victim and suspect or suspects, the effect of the prosecution on the suspect and the victim comes last, of course, the risk of the suspect offending again, and the alternatives to prosecution, if any. So she dealt with these in turn, and this is what she said. The impact on me was devastating. I was suicidal for months afterwards. I had to undergo corrective surgery for damage done to my arm. I still bear the scars, and I will for the rest of my life. The other thing to mention is that corrective surgery, look away, please, if you're squeamish, because I am about to show 2 slides with cut limbs on them. So please avert your gaze if you'd rather not look at these. On 3, 1, 2, 3. That is the first one. The second one now is slightly more graphic, and it is upsetting, and I'm owning that, and I'm aware that this is emotive, but you know what? Good, because this is an emotive issue, and we still need to stop being circumspect about victims and how we treat them. So this is on 3, the second slide, 1, 2, 3. So that is what this child had done to herself, because this is how being raped made her feel about herself. The corrective surgery, she had an excellent surgeon, just to say, and it would be difficult to tell that she had damaged herself at all. I'm moving on. Okay, back again to back to the letter. If you've been averting your eyes, it's safe to look back again now. And actually, just to say that the years of therapy and the corrective surgery that she needed were paid out of the pocket of her family, because there was no provision for any of these fees to be paid by anybody, except the family themselves. There is no recourse under victims' redress, is what I was trying to say. So point 3 then is the age and personal circumstances of the victim and the suspect. Now, while the child was 13 and 14 when the offences were committed against her, as she highlights here herself, those who attacked me were over the age of 12, which is the age of criminal culpability in Ireland. As a younger person, I would have been terrified and traumatised. That's how she's talking about how giving evidence would have terrified and traumatised her. She talks about her own personal circumstances. She outlines that she did have attachment difficulties. She was very premature and spent time away from her mother. She was a couple of months old before they had a chance to properly bond. So she acknowledges that, and she refers to that. There are attachment difficulties. She mentions trauma from her early childhood. She mentions that she grew up in a single parent family where, they weren't particularly affluent. Those are her personal circumstances. Now, what she doesn't say, perhaps because she's a little bit more polite than I am, is that the perpetrators of the crime, as well as being over the age of 12, are all from very wealthy families. They went to private schools. They go to private schools. They were having the benefit of a good education. Their fathers were pillars of the community, well known. And they played sport. As to the effect of the prosecution on the victim, she does admit that as a younger person, she would have been terrified and traumatized at the idea of being involved in a court case. But then she says, at this stage, I am much stronger in myself. I would be capable of giving evidence. In terms of the risk of the suspect offending, well, offenders who are allowed to commit offences will continue to do so unless and until they are shown the error of their ways and are genuinely remorseful. And we know that. I mean, Hiscox, Witt and Harron, for example, in 2007, mentioned that many adult sex offenders report an adolescent onset. Again, there are echoes of this in Dr. Walsh's paper that she gave earlier, in suggesting that early detection and treatment could result in reducing reoffence in adulthood. A meta-analysis of 82 recidivism studies by Hansen and Morton in 2015, which included a total of 29,540 sexual offenders, identified deviant sexual preferences and antisocial orientation as the major predictors of sexual recidivism for both adult and adolescent sexual offenders. The alternative to prosecution, if any, is mentioned in the points that were received from the DPP's office. Well, there was an alternative to prosecution. I've mentioned it earlier, but the JLO was of the opinion that these offences were too serious to be dealt with under the scheme. And as the judicial system has decided not to deal with the perpetrators under that scheme, the only way to legally address the damage done to me is through the courts. But that is also being denied to this victim. Not pursuing these self-confessed sex offenders is quite literally giving them the message that what they have done is effectively legal in Ireland. There's no incentive to consider their behaviour, to reflect and reform, because it's been condoned by the DPP in her decision not to prosecute. The final paragraph here says, please understand that I will not allow myself and the other countless victims that the DPP is creating with this decision to be dismissed like this. I will pursue justice through every means and every avenue open to me, which is why a copy of this letter is being forwarded to Minister McEntee, to appraiser of the situation as it stands. Now, as an aside, the Minister's office did write back to say the Minister doesn't have the power to direct the DPP. It's fair enough. And this girl finishes by saying that she's prepared to use every instrument at her disposal to ensure that justice is served. I'm going to stop sharing again. I don't need to tell you that I'm stopping sharing, do I? I just need to stop it, right? So look, I'm going to hold my hand up and confess that I am one of her instruments. I've often been called a tool, but that's okay. Because she wants this to be known. This child victim wants other victims to know that this is how they will be treated. She wants it known that rape is essentially legal in Ireland because the laws are not applied. Now, the DPP's office had the final say in February of this year when they wrote and said, in relation to 3 of the boys in your statement, you do not say that contact was without your consent. But according to Irish laws, a child of 13 or 14 cannot give consent. So I would argue that that point is completely moot. And in relation to the 4th boy, we concluded that there was insufficient evidence to prove a lack of consent. Well, that's because he flipping well left the country, isn't it? So they carefully noted what she had to say about the public interest, but then they reminded her that it is not the rule that all offences for which there is sufficient evidence must be automatically prosecuted. We must be satisfied that it is in, wait for it, the public interest to prosecute. Again, here is the DPP's office telling us that it is not in the public interest to prosecute rapists. The decision was based on the particular circumstances of this case on public interest grounds, just in case we weren't sure about that. And finally, the letter ends, I can confirm that the director considered the alleged taking of photographs by one suspect. Well, it's not alleged because you've seen the results of it, you've seen the photographs, they're in the file, without consent as part of the overall complaint. And that is also part of the public interest decision not to prosecute. So in other words, there are pictures of this child having just been raped, upset, crying, circulating on the internet to this day. And the DPP doesn't think it's in the public interest to prosecute the person who took those photographs or anyone else who happened to forward them on. But look, I don't want to end on a downer. There is a little bit of light, there is a chink of light. I've had the good fortune of having met on a number of occasions a man that I hold in incredible high regard and self-esteem. And that's Detective Chief Superintendent Declan Daly of the Garda National Protective Services Bureau. It's a long title. I brought the case to his attention because, as I said, we've bumped into each other on a number of occasions when I have been supporting other victims, and he was kind enough to respond to me. I gave him the case number with permission, and he requested the file from the DPP, had a look at it. And he said that really effectively there was nothing more that could be done, that all possible avenues had actually been exhausted. He did say, however, that he'd recommended a review of how such cases are treated by the DPP's office going forward. And this email was sent to the young woman in question. He told her that he admired her bravery, he admired her tenacity, and he admired her for surviving what she had been through. So I spoke to her afterwards and I asked the very simple question, how did that make you feel? And her response was that while she knew she was never going to get justice, by disclosing and by continuing to disclose and by pushing as hard and as far as she could for justice for herself, she has opened the door to justice being served to those who come after her. That perhaps the next young woman, because we know there will be a next young woman, who is attacked by young men will not have to read over and over again in letters from the DPP's office that it is not in the public interest to prosecute. I'm sorry, I have gone a little bit over time. I'm really grateful to you for listening. And of course, I'm always grateful to Dr. Joe Mooney for the opportunity to share this paper. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hazel. Thanks for sharing that with us. And it just, at the very end there, that power of just the acknowledgement. And somebody asked in the question earlier on about, this difficulty around telling adults that you believe them. When we look at it as best practice in terms of children originally, and it's again the law entering and confusing the situation of where you want to go as a human, first and foremost. So I'm really delighted you have shared that with us, and I've shared some support information there in the chat for everybody in the audience as well. And we do have some questions, but I'm going to move to our second panelist in this session, and we'll come back together because I'm sure people will have questions around your insight on this area as well, Hazel, when we're finished this session. So I want to introduce, if I can find Mick. I need to let you in, Mick, I think. So you should be able to unmute and come on camera. Yes.
Here we go.
Here we go. We are here. Good stuff. So I want to introduce you. Thank you first and foremost for joining us, Mick. And we do have some time. We'll take a little bit of your Q&A time to make sure you both have time to present. But we're going to, I suppose, hopefully have some discussion towards the end of this between yourself and Hazel. And I want to just thank you again for being with us today, Mick, and taking the time. So in terms of yourself, Mick, Mick is a native of Dublin Inner City, who's an experienced health and social care professional. He has worked in various independent and assertive outreach roles across the UK and Ireland. And Mick is an expert by lived experience and has a passion for working with disadvantaged and marginalised groups. He's also worked in partnership with the Health Education England and the NHS Improvement as a member of their expert referencing group, which developed a new competency framework for lived experience roles within the NHS in the UK. And Mick might speak a little bit about that when we get going. This now forms part of their national programme to develop new roles and expand others to transform the mental health workforce in England. He lives to pass on his story of hope and recovery to help others avoid the pitfalls into which he fell. Mick is a national advisor to London's Royal College of Psychiatrists, working with the National Collaborating Centre for Mental Health. Now living back in Dublin and studying at Trinity College Dublin to become a social worker, if I can say that, Mick. He also sits on the board of directors of Curie Farm, and he might say a little bit about that as well. So Mick, without further ado, I want to hand over to yourself to introduce yourself to us.
Yeah, I'm Mick, and I'm a student social worker in Dublin, and thanks, Joe, for inviting me here today to share my lived experience of this retrospective disclosures with yourself.
Yeah, so we're going to do a little bit of an interview kind of style for this presentation. We'd agreed earlier on. So obviously, Mick, I know you a little while now, and I know that you have come through the child protection process in terms of making a disclosure. But maybe if you can bring us back, if you're okay, to sort of coming forward initially and that initial sense and experience of not being believed.
Yeah, well, like I grew up in the inner city, and I grew up in the flats in the Nor Avenue, which is like a very, if anyone knows St. Teresa's Gardens, it was very kind of socioeconomically deprived area. It was, had a choking inner city drug culture. And when I first disclosed to the guards in Sundrive Garda station, they ran me from the station, they didn't want to know. Me and my friend Darren O'Brien, he came with me for support, to help me and stuff like that, because I was quite upset about what happened and stuff. He only previously, about a month ago, was raped as a child. You know what I mean? And I was looking for support off the guards, and sadly didn't get it. And then eventually I went back to the cops, and there was a detective who did take the statement and tried his very best to get a prosecution, but the DPP came back with no prosecution. Yeah.
Okay, so we're seeing similar to what Hazel just put forward there, and probably a lot of similar arguments, I would imagine, coming back in that justification that we're putting forward. So, I mean, you'd originally come forward, and there's that sense of, obviously, first of all, not getting a response maybe, or not being believed. So there's a delay period then between the next kind of official engagement in terms of coming forward.
Yeah, like I ended up leaving Dublin and moving to London, and trying to kind of basically run away from the problems that I was experiencing, the trauma, and that manifested in kind of suicide, and to the point where I ended up getting sectioned under the Mental Health Act. It was in 2011 that I wrote to the head of the organisation, the St. John's Ambulance, and I explained what happened to me again, because I did disclose to them back in 1999, and they just didn't really want to know. They did say that there was we have a child protection officer now, and that child protection officer then made a referral to the HSC at the time, in relation to kind of me making, I think that was probably the third time I disclosed, what happened to me. And then I didn't hear anything for a long time. I got contacted by the guards in 2015. They said that new survivors have come forward, that they have made statements, and we all thought, brilliant, that's going to be, we might get a bit of closure here. And that didn't really materialize. I ended up, no prosecution again, even with, 3 people who kind of, who were, sadly the victims of the perpetrator, who was prolific within St. John's Ambulance, and multiple other survivors have now since come forward. But yeah, it was just, heartbreaking. And then in 2018, when I was contacted by a social worker in Tulsa, who said that they had a referral for me from back in 2011 or whatever year it was, and that went on for quite some time. They were brilliant, they were very kind of understanding. I met with them, they communicated really well with me, and couldn't fault them, you know what I mean. Very understanding, very supportive. But then that process carried on for what I'd say another 2 years, because the perpetrator was gaming the system. He was not engaging with the social work team. He, was unwell. He must have been the sickest person in Dublin, the amount of times he was unable to present, and meet with the social workers to discuss the allegations. And eventually then we got a founded outcome, and just the relief, 20 odd years later, when you've been told all the time that everything that happened to you, didn't happen, and no one believed you, and nobody really wanted to know, and you just kind of be like, what's the point? And then you get that letter from Tulsa, and it's founded, and, brilliant. It's kind of like a weight lifted off your shoulder. There's a bit of, a bit of closure, and then you get another letter saying that he's appealed it. And then you're like thrown back into the whole thing of like, you're worried about kind of like, oh no way, he's going to play the system and do whatever. But thankfully then an independent, I don't really know, because Tulsa weren't very transparent about the appeals process with me, but they said that an independent panel upheld the original founded outcome. And it was because of that I ended up then kind of, making amends with the family and having that relationship, wouldn't have happened if I hadn't got that founded outcome.
So there was that initial sort of disbelief within your own family until your physical letter.
Yeah, I think the family, just to be fair, the majority of the people that kind of come from those areas, they probably, especially my dad, he would lack the emotional intelligence. You'd sooner get a dig in the head than a hug, you know what I mean? Like he wouldn't be the most emotionally intelligent person. So, you know, for him, he'd have to see it in black and white. And yeah, it was, you know, like when I went up to the pub and I showed him, he just broke down crying and was so apologetic, you know. He passed away there last year, do you know what I mean? During the pandemic. So yeah, it was not, you know, that was kind of like a bittersweet moment for me, kind of being able to, you know, use that kind of process to kind of, you know, have that relationship, you know, with the family again, you know.
Yeah, and I mean that's really important, Nick. And I suppose that, you know, and you know, we kind of spoke earlier on about sharing that story, and as I said at the time, I think the importance of that is it's not just the outcome of an assessment, or it's not just a letter. It has this weight and significance to lots of people. And the reason it kind of clicked with me when we spoke about it originally was because of my own research. That similar sentiment had come up, that even, you know, getting it on a letter, getting it on a piece of paper, just had this weight with it, and had this legitimacy with it. You know, that people said, right, somebody's taking this seriously, you know, and you were able to then bring that to your family, and it set in course a new form of relationship that was maybe you know, repressed before that. You know, so that's the point, I suppose. I think it's really important for people to hear that.
Yeah, like you know, when you spend nearly 23 years telling people you were sexually abused and raped, and no one's believing you, and you're writing to ministers and they're telling you they can't help you, and you're wrecking everyone's head, and you're like, right, come on, will someone help me? You know, and it was literally just from rattling cages and knocking on doors and just being, you know, consistently annoying. You know, to kind of like really kind of, which resulted in actually the current Minister for Children basically bringing the St. John's ambulance in and you know, pushing them to do an independent review, which is being headed up by Dr. Jeffrey Shannon. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really important. And I think for people who are unaware, the work of that review is ongoing at the moment. So I suppose there's a lot of us paying attention to the outcome of that.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's ongoing at the moment. He's waiting for bits and bobs from the St. John's ambulance, and then he's going to meet with the survivors and other people that have contacted him and stuff like that. And then I'm sure I'm hoping he will publish his findings in early next year. Yeah, that's that. Yeah. I think that's the timescale that Roger O'Gorman and Michelle Clark were telling me. Anyway, you know, so. Okay. Yeah, so it's been a bit of a uphill battle, but got there in the end, thankfully.
Yeah, and I mean that brings me to kind of the next piece that I wanted to talk to you about, because you know, you've got to that stage, and you've gotten to this stage now with this review process, and you're engaging with other people impacted, some of which have come forward and some of whom haven't, from what I understand. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what holds people back and what helps.
I think what helps lads coming forward is kind of that unity that they're not alone. You know, there's a real shame about being sexually abused as a man. You know, it's real kind of like, you know, blokes are worried that their sexuality will be questioned, or, you know, there's kind of like a very narrow-minded view around that. You know, I think like there's the strength in numbers, and like there's a group of us now that we kind of, you know, we meet up and we just kind of go for a coffee or, you know, walk in the park, or, you know, just kind of support each other through the process. Because I know what it's like for them, because when I first disclosed all those years ago, I was on my own. So it's, you know, it's nice to be able to kind of help them kind of navigate that process. But what stops, like, there are other survivors that have reached out to me and they don't want to come forward because they've seen how, and as Hazel pointed out in her presentation, you know, like the DPP just aren't interested, you know, like it's almost like a roll of the dice who's going to be, whose foil that, you know, your case kind of goes in front of, to depend on what the outcome is. But the lads that I've been chatting to who won't come forward, they're embarrassed and they're ashamed, and, you know, maybe a couple of years down the line they might have that, you know, penny drop moment where they go, you know what, Mick, I need a bit of support, I'm struggling here. And the reality is a lot of the blokes are struggling because they don't know how to communicate effectively with with their partners or their kids or employers about what happened to them. And they really struggle with that, you know, because they're, again, just the stigma that's attached to, you know, being a man who was raped as a child. You know, it's not, you know, like that itself comes with its own kind of lifelong kind of injuries. You know, I've had several operations because of infections and stuff like that when I was a kid, and, you know, not being brought to the hospital, you know, at the time, not being referred, and then spending quite a long time then after that sleeping on the streets, sleeping rough in Dublin, you know. So the impact of the whole thing has been, you know, yeah, hasn't been easy at times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, that just makes the contrast even more stark between the work you are doing and the voice you are for others. And you know, I see that day in, day out, and on social media, obviously, but in terms of this review as well, I mean, you had a huge part in that. And we spoke earlier on, I suppose, Mick, about there's been a lot of criticism of various services and various agencies, some of it valid, some of it heavy-handed by the media, etc. But we talked about kind of this is a learning opportunity, listening to people like yourselves, and you know, if you want to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity, you know, for organisations to work with survivors to develop, you know, maybe a quality improvement initiative to kind of, you know, co-produce something that kind of, you know, meets the needs of everybody, you know, whether it's the social workers in their statutory role or the survivors, you know, coming together and sharing that kind of that experience and what works well. Because, you know, I'll be honest with you, you know, handing someone a founded letter after so long, and then they go, well, if you need support, here's a couple of numbers you can ring. Like, it's not, you know, for me, given the gravity of what happens, you know, I don't think that is appropriate. It's almost like we've done our job. You know, we've ticked the box. And that's not me kind of slagging off the people that helped me. They did a great job. But I do think, you know, to have a comprehensive support package needs to be in place for, and I hate this word, adult complainants. You know, you just can't kind of just, right, there you go, there's your letter, see you later, good luck. You know,
I think that's key, and the words you use there, because I bandy on about you know, we need to be led by the voices, we need to look to people who are experienced, but you talk about co-production, and maybe you could before we finish up, maybe you could say a little bit about that, and you know what that might look like in this space.
Co-production is just basically kind of working together to develop a service that kind of, because it's, you know, there's that power imbalance, you know, kind of, you know, when I started working in services and they're like, he's not even trained, he's mad, don't be listening to him. And the reality is, you know, while I'm not trying to have certain skills and understandings that could help, you know, de-escalate situations and stuff like that. And that's one of the things I did within the NHS, you know, was we co-produced a restrictive practice, reducing restrictive practices within the National Mental Health Safety Improvement Programme, visiting hospitals across the UK, ensuring that staff were developing these programs, not just with the peer support workers, but the people with experience, but also the patients, you know, putting them at the centre of their care plan, because mental health services are not it's very kind of, you know, us and them kind of mentality sometimes. You know, it's almost like lunatics taking over the asylum attitude. No one's really interested in kind of, you know, working with that. But thankfully in the UK, it's moved more in that, and it's kind of going towards the recovery model, as opposed to kind of like the medical model. So it's more kind of biopsychosocial in its approach now. So it's great to see, and hopefully that will, you know, mirror here.
Exactly, and I'd echo that, because I mean, I try to put voices of individuals affected through my research into the policy domain when there shouldn't be a need for me at all, and I should be redundant in that sense. There should be that level of co-production when systems, policies, and practices are being designed, as you say. So I think maybe that's a nice message for us to kind of wrap up this piece. And I want you to stay with us, obviously, because we have lots coming in here, and I want to just bring Hazel back in as well. And thank you very much, Mick, for taking the time. Just stay with us there. And Hazel, maybe if you can come back on camera, and we can just maybe have a look at some of the questions and comments that are coming in here. let me see, are you, let me, oh, you can see Hazel. So she's on the screen. 1 second. I'm going to give everybody gallery view then. Can everybody see gallery view there? Yes. Apologies, Hazel. You've been there in wait. Listen, first of all, thanks to you both. Maybe I won't go straight to questions. Maybe I'll hand it over straight back to yourselves. We're talking about encouragement, facilitation and support. And my thinking on this was in the broadest sense possible. So for you guys, either from your own experiences or in terms of the advocacy that you're involved in or the people you're engaging with, what's missing?
Gosh, where to start? What's missing is, there's a number of things. If we have a look at the legal journey, for example, there is a lack of provision of support for the victims. And we know that. We know that victims are never seen as legal entities in their own right. They're seen as witnesses for the prosecution, which is the state. So they're not entitled to legal representation. They're not entitled to trauma-informed care. They're not entitled to, for example, support dogs in the witness box. There's very little, they're not even entitled to information necessarily. It's up to the individual guard or detective who's in charge of your case, what you're told and when. And there is, and as somebody actually else, one of the participants here mentioned, was a member of the audience, and I'm sorry, I didn't take cognizance of the name, but made the essentially very good point that we don't have a proper definition of what the public interest is. You know, I mean, there were, I think 518 people sent to prison for non-payment of fines in 2018. So what, prosecuting somebody for not paying their television license is more in the public interest than prosecuting somebody who's admitted that they've raped somebody else. I failed to see that, and maybe it's just because I'm too close to it, although I don't think so. And also there is a lack of awareness in the general public about how the judicial system works. You know, how often have we heard, don't say things like that, you'll ruin that man's reputation. Yeah, well, we've seen that doesn't happen. We've also heard people say things like, oh, you need to stand back and let due process run its course, and that unless there is a conviction, then the person is innocent. And that's also not true, because as we've seen, there seems to be a sense that you can be, and I am being slightly facetious here, but bear with me, it's just for illustrative purposes, but that you can be raped on a Monday, go to the guards on a Tuesday, the perpetrator is arrested on a Wednesday, and he's up in court the following Monday. Like, that is not how it happens. Our judicial system moves at the rate of a snail going backwards up a hill through treacle, and that's on a good day. And I do understand that it needs to be meticulous, and all the I's need to be dotted and the T's need to be crossed before the file even goes to the DPP. I am aware of that, because it doesn't want to be thrown out in a technicality. And the guards are doing, you know, in some instances, because I know I am hearing Mick saying that he was just laughed out of the station or just thrown out of the station, told to feck off with himself, to, you know, use the vernacular. You know, so I can't say that every single guard is historically was wonderful, but there is definitely training that's happening. There is definitely awareness. And there is, as of earlier this year, as far as I'm aware, there is a trained officer, if not in every guard station, accessible to every guard station, who is trained on how to take statements and how to take disclosure. We also don't have enough care for professionals in the field. We don't have enough care for people who are on the receiving end. And I mean everybody from teachers to doctors to midwives, Gardaí themselves, social workers. There isn't enough support for them when around disclosure. If somebody comes to me and discloses, I'm a teacher and I've just done algebra, that'll never happen. And a child comes up to me and says, you know, says that they want to tell me something because they happen to like me, and they say, look, there's something happening at home, and and what does the teacher do with that? Well, apart from filling in a form of mandate, you know, complying with the mandated reporting laws, where's the support for them if they also have a history of child sexual abuse and this is upsetting and triggering for them? Where do they go with that? Nowhere. I can go on, Joe, but I can also stop.
No, absolutely. I think that's a key point as well, and something that's often missed in this space, that, you know, we are, I'm thinking my own profession in social work, and there's a disproportionate representation of people within the profession that are affected by trauma themselves. And engaging in this work, I'm often reminding the students that when you're engaging with somebody impacted by abuse in terms of working with children in the child protection system, you could also be engaging with their parents or their caregivers or you know, important adults in their lives who are also impacted, and you need to be factoring that in. So for social work, for professions themselves, Gardaí, and as I had in the chat, we had an invite out to Declan Daly, and he unfortunately couldn't attend the Criminal Justice Conference today as well. And I won't speak for them, but they have developed regional teams in terms of the National Protected Services Bureau. And the skill set is developing there, in fairness. And in terms of yourself, Mick, do you know, for you, what's the biggest gap?
I'd like to see some real accountability for the DPP, because, like, you know, there needs to be somebody that, you know, that's above them, that reviews their decisions of not to prosecute. I think that would then kind of maybe, you know, hold people to account, and would improve the outcomes for survivors, you know, who do come forward and seek the help of either the guards or social services. You know what I mean? I think that needs to be done. You know, I think that then that would give greater transparency as well, because it's all about cloak and dagger when you're writing to the DPP.
Yeah.
Because when I saw Hazel's letters there, I got similar ones myself from them, you know, and they didn't really give me an answer to why they wouldn't prosecute them, you know what I mean? And the same with the other survivors as well, when they went forward and they were rejected and they got the same letters, and, you know, it just, yeah, I think that needs to be looked at, and needs that there needs to be real accountability and transparency on how they come to the decision-making process on who gets prosecuted and who doesn't, because I don't think that's very clear.
I think they're fair points, and I do want to give the audience a chance here. So we have a question in from John Moore to Hazel and Mick. If they feel there is scope within this area for restorative justice model, given that the level of prosecution and even the prevalence of persons coming forward to seek justice is so poor internationally. Thanks, John, for that question. Any thoughts on that, guys?
Funny, it's an excellent question. Thanks a million for that one, John. You've made us all think. I was reading something within the past fortnight about restorative justice and sexual violence, and it doesn't seem to be a particularly useful way to go from what the research is telling us. And I think restorative justice is a nice idea, but I'm reminded of Nelson Mandela and his call that we need for truth and reconciliation. But in order for there to be truth and reconciliation, you need the truth. And people who sexually abuse are, the other thing is that very few of them actually get caught. And I wrote about this during the last week, that our model, our template, our idea of what an abuser is the person who takes part in these restorative justice pieces, who takes part in the transformative psychological pieces, well, you know, the programs. And these are people who have some level of awareness, some level that what they have done is wrong, some sense of culpability, some sense of responsibility. And they are also, and forgive me for saying this, they're the ones who weren't crafty enough not to get caught. The vast majority of abusers do not get caught, or if they are questioned or arrested or spoken to under caution or whatever way, they are asked to respond to a charge. As we've seen, there are so few that are actually sent forward for prosecution. So you're not actually talking to, when you're talking to abusers who are in prison and who agree to take part in these kind of, the word that came to mind was ceremonies, but that's not correct. That's doing a disservice. But these kind of programs, you're talking to, you're not getting a snapshot of what the average abuser looks like. You're getting you're looking at, and you're talking to the exceptions to the rule. And I think that with restorative justice, first of all, the person needs, the perpetrator needs to be in the criminal system, they need to be engaging with the judiciary. And most of our abusers aren't, mine aren't, they're out walking out, around the place. So many people's aren't, they get away with it because they get crafty. And if they come across somebody like me who's a bit mouthy and goes and discloses, they move on to another victim who won't be quite as mouthy, or who they've learned to assert more power over. So I think it's a nice idea, but it's a bit too ideal to be applied to this situation unless we whip our society into shape, where we kind of go, actually, this really isn't cool. We no longer condone or accept or legalize sexual assault and rape. Yeah, I think that's probably my position on it. What do you think, Mick?
Not much I can add to that. I totally agree. I wouldn't, unless they're willing to kind of, accept what they've done is wrong and all that jazz, I wouldn't be necessarily a big fan of it, to be fair,
Mm. I also think that it speaks a little bit to the expectation that as the abused people, we must forgive because that's somehow the higher moral ground. And I have thoughts and feelings on that one. I don't think that we necessarily need to forgive anybody except ourselves for victim blaming that always happens. We need to forgive ourselves for feeling ashamed of ourselves because we did nothing wrong. We need to forgive ourselves for any guilt that we may carry and hand it back to the person to whom it rightly belongs. But we don't need to forgive anybody else. And the idea that in order to move on and heal and restore ourselves that we need to forgive, I don't think that's necessary. And I'm trying to keep my language nice and polite here.
That's appreciated. Way. I'm going to run through some of the comments, guys, because I want you to hear them. There's lots here, and we haven't had a huge chance to get through everything and to get to everybody, given the content and given the excellent presentations. You guys have the ability to get in and type back to people yourselves if you so wish on the Q&A. But I just want to run through some before we finish up this session and say thanks to you both. We have one here from Kieran Campbell, who says, both Hazel and Mick's accounts reiterate the need for embedding of the EU Victims Directive in Irish law. And if state agency record that the complainants are believed, this is then taken as victim bias. We need to be able to communicate that they are believed. Does Mick or Hazel have any suggestions on how we can be more supportive and facilitative on their journey of disclosing? So that's it's kind of following on from work this morning, but there is that, I think you mentioned it, Hazel, that due process piece kind of shoves everything else out of the way, including care and warmth. So maybe I'll take another couple of comments on that, and feel free to come back to Kieran via the chat on that as well. We have lots of great work, well done, and thank you for your presentation. Una has asked here, great presentation, Hazel and Mick, thank you both. As a counsellor, I would wonder, would a training program similar to Assist be applied for people like myself, Garda, doctors, etc., in how to support adults who disclose historical abuse based on qualitative research? A simple information leaflet could be given to someone who is disclosing as to the step in how they can proceed, and also what happens when they do make a report. Maybe this already exists, and maybe speaking for social work, there's a development in process, and I won't speak for TUSLA themselves, but I am aware there's a development in process around just that basic information that the research I presented, it wasn't present for the adults who engaged in that research. But there is a development around that, and there's a lot of work going on around that at the moment. But in other services, what do you think about that as a recommendation?
Absolutely. The more awareness, yeah. Go ahead, Mick, sorry. Yeah,
no, I think it's important. I think sometimes people get uncomfortable, don't they? They get really uncomfortable when you're talking about kind of, the stuff that happened to you. They get really awkward, and then they kind of don't know how to respond appropriately. They don't know what to say and do, and then they kind of then say something that might end up, making things probably worse, you know, in my experience anyway, you know. So yeah, I think definitely like training, and I think language is key to understanding, isn't it? So I think if you had some sort of training program around that, that would certainly help. You know, survivors seeking help in any setting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and actually that is part of the training that I would provide to nurses and doctors and midwives and other professionals, is around language and what to say when somebody discloses, and just as importantly, what not to say. You know, because sometimes something comes out of your mouth before you mean it to, like, and the examples that I use are things that I've heard either firsthand or that have been said to people who disclosed to me. Things like, oh, that's disgusting, or, oh, that was so long ago, are you not over it yet? Are you not over it yet? No is the answer, and I never will be. And it's one of those things that if somebody loses their own child, God forbid, and it's an awful thing to happen, we don't expect people to get over that. They are allowed to carry that grief and that trauma. You know, society allows them to carry that grief and that trauma throughout their lives. But our childhoods are killed, are taken from us, and we're supposed to shut up about it after a prescribed amount of time. And I think that an awareness that actually, no, we do carry the trauma, as was expressed in some of the papers earlier today, that needs to be recognised a bit more, that it doesn't, that the trauma and the grief doesn't just slough off you when you're 18 and now you're an adult, so it should all be behind you. That isn't how it works.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Hazel. And I think, you know, it comes from the work of Ramona, is going to speak later on as well, that, you know, we're going to meet adults in these services. They're going to come into contact with these services who have had variable responses, variable reactions to their disclosure, and can't be expected to have worked through the traumatization just by the passage of time. So I think that's a really important point. I just want to run some other just comments here. Marie Keenan, our colleague here in UCD, has a comment, some myths about restorative justice, neither forgiveness nor apology essential for excellent outcomes for victim survivors. Happy to follow up on the potential role of restorative justice addressing the justice gaps. And I will respond to Marie's question, so it goes into the chat. She leaves her email address there. A great job, Hazel and Mick, and thanks and well done. And there is lots more here, guys, which you will have access to come through. And there's questions there from earlier on as well, which I hope to try and get to myself once the presentations finish. But unfortunately, we can't get to them just now. So listen, guys, I really want to thank you for your presentations and for being with us today. I think it was really important that you're with us today, and an essential part of the conversation and a starting point of the conversation as far as I'm concerned. So thank you very much. You're free, obviously, to stay on board. I will mute and silence you in a moment. But the Q&A is open to you guys, and you can type in there to individuals if there's questions that relate to yourselves or questions you feel you can contribute to. Thanks a million. So I'm going to move us on to our next phase. I'm really delighted to have on board Deirdre Kenny and Rosaleen McElvaney. We're going to speak with Deirdre first, but this is our Voices from the Field session. And essentially it was bringing people together, and this was the session we unfortunately weren't able to include Chief Superintendent Declan Daly in this session, but we are very delighted to have Deirdre Kenny from 1 in 4 and also Rosaleen McElvaney from St. Clair's unit. And they're going to talk about their own experiences, and I think Deirdre would have a large degree of experience in the criminal justice system in terms of accompanying people to the courts, and may have some comments on Mick and Hazel's contributions also. So I'm going to hopefully welcome Deirdre here. If I can make you host 1 second, Deirdre. So you should be co-host now and able to come on screen. And before Deirdre's presentation, I have a short video on behalf of 1 in 4 Deirdre is representing, and I just want to make sure this shares properly for you. And this is about 3 minutes, guys. So, and then we will move to our chat with Deirdre.
terms of engaging with the service, one man always stays with me, and it was a story he told that he actually contacted us while he was waiting in the car park while his wife was doing her shopping in Tesco. And what I really liked about it, for him, it was a really momentous decision, this really huge thing to do, but in this backdrop of just normal everyday life. And he said he shocked himself and shocked his wife, but it's the first and perhaps the biggest hurdle, is lifting the phone.
I think people find it very difficult to take that first step, in part because of the shame that's associated with sexual abuse.
One of the things abuse does is erode the sense of self and of self-confidence.
We know how hard it is, and when you contact 114, you're going to meet on the telephone somebody who understands what you've been through, somebody who's going to be sensitive and compassionate.
I think it feels like a really big thing to pick up the phone because essentially they are breaking the secret that they've been conditioned to keep since childhood.
But it's the beginning of them taking something back.
So the first voice that someone will hear when they contact is Anne-Marie at reception.
Anne-Marie has been working with us for 15 years now. She really understands how difficult it is to walk in that door.
She's always very welcoming and, you know, always puts them at ease.
Then after that, they will meet one of the therapy team.
The initial meeting would happen through phone call or online via Zoom. It's a personal preference. And then, you know, the therapist would take it from there.
The steps to recovery are perhaps first of all to acknowledge what has happened.
Then it's perhaps learning to initially manage and then contain a lot of the impacts of trauma.
Then once somebody comes into therapy, a lot of the work is about putting in place the supports the person needs in their life outside of therapy.
I think people learn to be more acceptant of themselves, you know, and how they are. So it's like the abuse becomes smaller, you know.
And it's also about beginning to explore the impact the sexual abuse has had on their lives.
Like I remember a woman in her 50s saying to me so clearly in the room, I never knew I could say no. Just something in her head, she couldn't think she could say no because that child couldn't say no, and if they did say no, they weren't heard.
I think it's absolutely possible to recover from the impacts of child sexual abuse.
People really do move on to live satisfying and healthy lives.
I think 1 in 4 provides a safe place, a place to listen, and, you know, maybe puts in some anchors and safety nets along the way.
We have hundreds of testimonies from survivors about how they experienced 1 in 4. People will say that they felt heard and understood.
For some survivors, it would say that, you know, it saved their life, you know.
I think what I see in clients is a change from going from existing in the world to actually living in the world.
Some people say in therapy that they wish that they'd come much sooner or reached out years earlier.
It is never, ever too late to get help.
You can only start your journey from where you stand today.
So thanks for sharing that with us, 1 in 4. And I'm going to hand over now to Deirdre Kenny. And Deirdre, you're very welcome. Deirdre is Deputy CEO of 1 in 4 and the Advocacy Director, a Dublin-based non-profit providing professional psychotherapy and for services. Excuse me, my video is still running here. Apologies. For services to men and women who've been sexually abused in childhood and to their families. 1 in 4 also delivers a sex offender intervention program to adults who acknowledge sexually harmful behaviour towards children and to their families. 1 in 4 engages actively in influencing policy and legislation that impacts on our clients. Deirdre has over 20 years experience working within the NGO sector in Ireland and Africa, predominantly with the area of sexual violence, but also covering the areas of HIV, AIDS, prostitution and trafficking. Deirdre is also a restorative justice facilitator and trainer. And Deirdre, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Joe.
So I think everybody can hear and see us. So I'm going to sort of hand it over to yourself. So maybe tell us a little bit about your role and your work with 1 in 4, dear Jo.
Thanks, Joe, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you here today. It's great to be a part of this event, and especially I think some of the inputs, well, the standout ones for me are Hazel and Mick, and I think their insights are invaluable and they'll really stay with me. I'm not sure what else I can add to what they said, but hopefully I can give you a bit of an insight into the work we do. Again, that video would have showed some of my colleagues and the psychotherapy work we do in 1 in 4. And as you said, I am the advocacy director, and myself and the team of case managers provide special support to adult survivors who engage in the criminal justice system or with TUSLA or with any of the other legal processes that are open to them. So that could be civil litigation or perhaps some of the inquiries or tribunals that have happened in the past. So we work with about 400 to 500 people every year. About 40–45% of them are men, and we have developed over the years wide experience in assisting survivors to negotiate that complex terrain that lies between their very personal traumatic experience of childhood sexual abuse and how that interacts with the various systems that they encounter. And again, I think Hazel and Mick give really clear testimony to what they endure in that process. So support with reporting to the Gardaí is probably the most common request that we get from survivors. And that has been especially the case in the last 2 years. I think lockdown has created a very unwelcome space for many people to reflect on their experience of child abuse. And they have really reached out to us en masse in terms of what they can do to try and get some validation or acknowledgement around the harm that's been caused to them. So again, the team are there really to facilitate contact with the authorities, whether that be TUSLA or the Gardaí, to give them clear information about the processes that are involved. And again, I think a lot of the presentations this morning reflected that, and again, your own research, Joe, that clear information about what happens within those processes can help empower people and help them decide whether it's something that they want to be a part of. The call that a client makes to us is often the very first time that they'll have disclosed something that has happened to them. Or it could be, as again, I think it was mentioned before, they have tried to tell in the past, but they haven't been heard. So we'll take as much time as we can and as much time as they need to build up that relationship. So it helps us and helps the client, so we can support them the best way we can. I guess when we're looking at facilitating disclosures today, I think it's always important, and it's something that we talk a lot about in 1 in 4, is how professionals have at the core of what they do, an understanding of the dynamics of childhood sexual abuse. And again, it's been talked about at length this morning, but it's always important, I think, to remind ourselves that the child will have experienced a power dynamic that will have instilled a secrecy and fear, feelings of guilt and responsibility through that grooming process. And long before sometimes the sexual act ever happens, there's a power dynamic that the child has been exposed to. And they will be conditioned to keep that secret. And there are often other dynamics at play, family dynamics, a family perhaps where mothers are disempowered and children are seen and not heard. So our clients carry a huge burden and a powerful message that has been given to them by the world, that they should never tell, and that there's something about them that has caused this to happen. And that immense feeling of shame and fear and exposure is so profound, that even when somebody does tell or does go to the guards or does sit in front of a social worker, that fear and anxiety and shame often is still very much to the fore. So, and as we know, and I think you said it yourself, Joe, earlier, that those dynamics are really mirrored in our society. Aside from maybe today, we don't talk about this issue openly, and it's not really, I think, widely understood or accepted by society, the extent of harm that sexual violence has caused in Ireland. So putting that in the context of the legal process that our team engage with all the time with survivors, I guess we know that and again, Hazel spoke about it earlier, survivors rely on the legal process to, in part, help them address their traumatic experience. And in reality, we know that the real cost to them is often re-traumatization. The law is applied to the crime, but very little attention is paid to how the system interacts with the personal impact of the crime. So I think we can have all the policies and procedures and laws in the world, but unless we truly take account of that experience and how trauma impacts people, then I'm not sure we're really serving survivors well. Trauma, I've witnessed myself, is always present, and undoubtedly it's an invisible witness in the legal process. It's not fully appreciated. And I think if we really want to improve the experience for survivors, disclosing within that system, whether it's TUSLA or to the guards or within the courts, we need to pay direct attention to how the system can integrate the insights on the impact of trauma. And that's not just trauma-informed practice. I think it's more than that. We need to extend the knowledge that we have of how trauma impacts society into how we manage sexual violence in this country. In 2016, we completed a study around the criminal justice system where our clients who'd been through the system spoke about their experience of it. And one of the survivors, her name is Sarah, and she said, her words were, "It was so inhumane. I felt the system in no way valued me, but it valued him much more. It never valued me." And I think that's something that we would hear regularly from people who even get the result they want from the DPP or get the result they want from a jury or even TUSLA, that there's always that power imbalance, and the legal system doesn't always address that properly. And it does require survivors to give sworn testimony of traumatic events in an environment that often mirrors the power and authority dynamics of the person's experience of abuse. And people can become so distressed and can respond in the same way as they did to the original trauma. I'm sure you've all heard me say it before, but there's the Harvard professor of psychiatry, Judith Herman, remarked that if one was to set out intentionally to design a system for provoking symptoms of traumatic stress, it would look very like a court of law. And Barbara, a client of ours, again, from the study called Only a Witness, she described the ongoing impact of revisiting the initial trauma while she gave evidence in court. And she said, "I couldn't go up there again and give my evidence. I just couldn't do it. It's one of the most awful things. I had awful trouble with it afterwards. They had a book of the house where I was born, and there was pictures of each of the rooms where I was abused. I'm still having trouble getting that out of my head." And I think that's something that myself and the team would regularly work through with clients, that, you know, they go to court or they speak to social workers about the trauma that they've suffered. But actually those conversations are often the thing that stay with them, and the reaction of the professionals involved in terms of intentionally or unintentionally, comments and language can reiterate a lot of the feelings that people feel about themselves in terms of trying to minimizing their own experience of abuse. So some people, again, in that context, experience flashbacks to the incident while they're giving evidence in court, and that's something we often witness. They become disorientated and confused, and the acute fear and distress is very live, and people aren't always aware that they're experiencing a flashback and feel it as if it's the trauma all happening all over again. Again, one of the participants in the research that we did, her name is Emily, and she described feeling re-traumatized and re-victimized by the process. And she said, "It's a really weird experience. I think afterwards it's really traumatic. I was so caught up in it at the time, I didn't realize what was happening. But 6 weeks later, when I look back, it was the most horrendous experience. It was a bit like a delayed reaction. At the time, everyone was talking about you as if you're brainless and really reinforcing your own negative beliefs about yourself." And again, it's not often spoken about, but self-harm is a risk factor rarely mentioned in the context of these issues. But it's a really live issue for the staff at 1 in 4 when we're supporting people in court. you really are, you're at the coalface in terms of the harm and injury that people are experiencing. So in order to facilitate witnesses to give the best account of themselves to any authority, whether that's the guards or TUSLA, I think it's always important to understand how the trauma is triggered at any point during that process. And that could be, making a disclosure to TUSLA or speaking to the guards, or later on, potentially giving evidence in court. And we've observed how language, and again, I think it was mentioned earlier, the tone of voice, the style of questioning, the uses of silences are all devices that can either reassure or trigger a traumatic stress response for a client. And I think, again, a quote from a client, a lady called Sarah, she spoke about her experience of giving evidence. And she said, I think overall, I was probably on the stand giving evidence for give or take 4 hours. I can't tell you how horrific it was being cross-examined. To this day, I can hear the barrister's voice in my ear crystal clear. It feels like it'll never leave me. My only saving grace is that I never looked at him. I picked a spot on the wall and I looked at that for a solid 4 hours. I actually couldn't tell you what he looked like, but if I heard his voice today, I would know it straight away. It's horrific. So survivors, I think, to sum up, they reach out and they take a massive risk when they choose to disclose, and their motivation can be various things. I think for many, it's important to get validation and acknowledgement, and maybe to hand back the responsibility where it is deserved. And for a lot of the people who contact us, it is about protecting others. But the impact of sexual violence is not something that fits into a neat box, and its effects are really complex. And I think if we're really committed to improving the disclosure experience for survivors in the system, it's time to incorporate what we know about trauma. And I know TUSLA are doing work on their new policy, and I think it's a great opportunity to really integrate some of the insights that Hazel and Mick talked about earlier. It's crucial for professionals to have proper support and be properly resourced. Now, having said all that, I have to say that I think the biggest issue that is facing us all, and the most important thing we can do to facilitate disclosure, is at a societal level. I think if our communities and our families and our environments can truly accept the harm that's caused in our communities, that will go a long way to validate the experience of survivors. And I think it's a timely opportunity maybe, and today is a good start to unlock a national conversation on this issue. And we really need to deal with the toxic shame that survivors experience, and to create a shift from the isolation and silence to a collective responsibility and restoration, because it's communities that protect children, not just social workers. So thanks, Joe, for the opportunity.
No, listen, thanks a million, Deirdre, to you for that insight into your own work, but also that perspective on what are the issues, and again, coming back to that societal shift that is needed. And again, I'm writing notes here, and they're quite similar to the notes I was writing with Hazel and Mick, and acknowledgement comes up, and acknowledging that person as an individual. The impacts and the effects of sexual abuse are not this generic homogenous kind of categorization that affect people. It's as individual as the individual themselves, and meeting people as individuals is a difficult task at the best of times. Never mind whether we're talking about something as simple as paying your phone bill to something as complex and traumatic as disclosing sexual abuse. But we need to be moving towards individual responses from a systemic base in relation to what you're saying, and addressing those bigger issues. There's questions in there earlier on, and again about the training, for the likes of social workers, for example. And I think you mentioned it there, and I've mentioned it previously, that we have policies and structures around this that are being led by the laws and the jurisprudence in this area, but aren't being led by the international research on the dynamics of abuse or disclosure. And I think if we even had a fraction of that proportionately to the legal aspect, the law needs to be held hand in hand, yes, and we need to work with and through it, but we also need to incorporate an understanding of what it's like to be abused and what it's like to disclose after such an abuse. So I really want to thank you, Deirdre, and if you can hold on with us, I'm going to move to our second speaker in this session, and that is Dr. Rosaleen McElvany, and Rosaleen should have, yes, there she is. Rosaleen, I think you're going to share slides, so I'm going to mute and get off screen for you, but just to introduce you, we're delighted to have you on board. And Dr. Rosaleen McElvany is clinical psychologist and psychotherapist and a fellow and past president of the Psychological Society of Ireland and an assistant professor in psychotherapy in DCU, Dublin City University. She co-manages the Sexual Abuse Therapy Service in St. Clair's Unit, CHI, at Connolly. She has published extensively on child sexual abuse disclosure, including a book for professionals called Helping Children Tell About Sexual Abuse, and that's with Jessica Kingsley Publishers in 2016. And also for parents, Finding the Words by Veritas in 2015. Rosaleen has served on the National Board for Safeguarding Children in the Catholic Church in Ireland, the Board of Crime Victims Helpline, and the Board of 1 in 4. The Board of Nursing and Midwifery Board of Ireland, and is currently a member of TUSLA's National Review Panel, which investigates the deaths of children in care and known to the child protection system. And I'm delighted to welcome Rosaleen today to share her wealth of experience with us. And Rosaleen, I will hand over to yourself now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today. My goodness, it's been such a rich day. I'm actually feeling a little bit overwhelmed by, taking in all the information, and I'm wondering what it's like for other participants who have been with us since this morning, because it's a lot of heavy information to take in. And on that point, what I'm going to focus on is kind of practical strategies for how we can help children tell. And the information that I'm going to draw on today, a lot of it is from research I've done or others have done, specifically focusing on what it's like for children or indeed adults to disclose. And when I use the term disclosure, I'm talking very much about informal disclosure. So I'm talking about those first tentative steps towards telling someone else about the experience of abuse, as distinct, let's say, from formal disclosure, as in making a report to the Gardaí, etc. So Joe has mentioned these books for those of you who want to read further. And also I have an article, Helping Children to Tell About Their Experiences of Sexual Abuse. So if anybody wants a kind of a brief version of I suppose, the learnings from the research and how we can translate that into practical strategies. I'm happy to send a copy of that article, or I think I'll share it with Joe and he can put it on his the collating material from today. So for the presentation this afternoon, I'm going to focus on these 6 key strategies. First of all, raising awareness about child sexual abuse. It's been mentioned several times over the course of the day how much more we need to educate people about sexual abuse. Secondly, creating opportunities for children to tell. We know from the research, children do not tell spontaneously. For the most part, they tell in the context where they've actually been provided an opportunity by an adult. Thirdly, sharing concerns about individual children. We know that disclosure is a process, and very often it's about putting the jigsaw pieces together to actually realize that a child is in a situation where they're being abused. And as adults or professionals, we need to be able to talk with each other, share information so that we can put those pieces together and see the fuller picture. Fourthly, I talk about responding to children's attempts to tell. Very often children will test the waters, and it's really important how we respond to that so that we can encourage them to tell us more. Because very often those first tentative steps, we don't really know what children are talking about. We don't really have a clear sense that they're talking about an experience of sexual abuse. So each response that we give will perhaps determine whether the child will tell us more or whether they'll tell someone else. The fifth strategy I talk about is supporting children's and young people's social networks, because we know that as children particularly get older and in the teenage years, they're much more likely to tell a friend first or a peer before they'll tell an adult. So it's really important that we pay attention to those peer networks, particularly in adolescence. And then finally, we know from particularly some large-scale studies looking at children's experiences that, we need to promote their resilience. We need a more strengths-focused approach in the way we engage with children, particularly following disclosure. that we work more with them, that we try and involve them in the decision-making processes as much as possible. So I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail, but keeping in mind these 4 key principles. It has been mentioned already by many of the speakers today that this is a very difficult topic. And as professionals, as helpers, as adults, we need to mind ourselves when we're trying to encourage conversations with children about sexual abuse. And we're human, and what they tell us has an impact on us. And I think that's sometimes why sometimes people have very negative experiences from professionals, because professionals are human too. And they're impacted by what they're listening to. Someone mentioned earlier, they could be triggered themselves in terms of their own experiences of childhood abuse. Even without that, you know, sexual abuse is a very difficult topic to talk about, and we're all impacted by that in different ways. And so we need to make sure that we have support, we have colleagues, we have managers, we have people that we can turn to talk to about this very difficult topic and what it's like then when we're in a position of trying to encourage children to talk about it. And then these 3 core pieces around facilitating awareness, expression, and action. And those are the threads that run through the strategies I'm talking about this afternoon. So the first strategy I mentioned, raising awareness. I suppose with all the public awareness campaigns, child abuse prevention programs, etc., we still have a huge level of ignorance about sexual abuse and the prevalence of sexual abuse, what it actually is, and the range of different abusive behaviours, who children are most likely to tell, that younger children are more likely to tell a parent, and older children are more likely to tell a peer. For children who perhaps don't, you know, feel comfortable talking to their parents or trusted adult, that they have access to someone else, maybe a teacher or a sports coach, etc. The importance of accepting a child's story, and people have talked about that, and the importance of being believed, and I'll come back to that later. The importance of not asking too many questions. It's a bit of a tightrope to work. On the one hand, you need to ask some questions. On the other hand, children can experience questions as that you doubt what they're saying, that you don't believe them. So trying to get that balance right. Appreciating, and again, this has been highlighted by other people, appreciating how difficult it is to tell. And I don't know that people actually still appreciate that, just how the hurdle that it is to jump over or to cross, to be able to expose yourself in that way and tell those intimate details. And then, as it's also been mentioned by several speakers, each child is different and they have their own unique thoughts and worries, etc., about, you know, what might happen if they tell, and what bad things might happen, and, you know, what good things might happen. And so each child needs to be dealt with differently. And while we can learn from the research, and it's important to be aware of what we know about on a larger scale, it's also really important to treat each individual child as a unique person in their own right, with their own unique story. I wanted to refer here to a study that Tenor and Sigad published in 2019, where they interviewed 20 educators about their experience of receiving disclosures from children. And they identified 3 strategies that the educators used in coping with the impact on them of receiving the disclosure. So one theme was very much about just coping with it on one's own, and you know, this idea of relying on themselves and not asking for help. A second theme was this layperson, which I come across a lot with professionals, where they experience themselves as, you know, very competent when dealing with lots of very complex issues. But as soon as sexual abuse is mentioned, it's, oh, I don't know enough about that. Oh, I'm not sure how to deal with that. You know, and feeling very much undermined and lacking the confidence that they actually have in relation to other issues. And then this third theme of buck passer. And I think very much motivated by the anxiety that is evoked in professionals of, you know, pass it on to someone else, rapidly shifting the responsibility onto a manager or somebody more experienced or more knowledgeable, etc. Wanted to make a point in terms of raising awareness about recognizing the signs. I'm not a believer in this idea of signs, even though lots of documents, policies, etc., describe indicators of sexual abuse. In practice, there are no indicators of sexual abuse. The ones that were there in the past no longer apply because each child is different, and all those indicators that we read about are simply indicators that there's something wrong, that there's something awry in the child's life. But they don't necessarily mean that it's sexual abuse. They could be as a result of other experiences. So I wanted to remind people, those of you who may be familiar and those of you who are not, Finkelhor and Brown in 1985 published this paper on the traumagenic dynamics of sexual abuse. And it's really about looking at the impact. So they proposed that there were 4 main areas in terms of the impact of sexual abuse: the stigmatization, that's the shame, the betrayal, so the loss of trust that the child experiences, because very often a child is abused by someone that they trust. The traumatic sexualization, which might range from children acting out sexually to children being quite phobic about sexual material. And then that powerlessness that Deirdre talked about earlier in terms of the power dynamic. And Finkelhor and Brown were suggesting that the combination of these 4 dynamics are what makes the experience of sexual abuse unique. But how the child actually manifests those differs from one child to another. Nevertheless, I think it's really important to think about how the child might be impacted in these 4 ways. I wrote a chapter for the Handbook of Counselling and Psychotherapy in 2017. And of course, there's a huge amount of research looking at impact of childhood sexual abuse. And I was trying to, in some way, simplify it or make it more manageable for readers. And I thought of these 3 themes: that first of all, it impacts on one's sense of self. It impacts on one's ability to emotionally regulate. And that's where all those kind of PTSD symptoms come from. And then thirdly, it impacts on relational capacity. And that ties into that idea of trust, because even when a child is not abused by someone that they trust and love, it still impacts on their ability to trust others. So the second key strategy, creating opportunities for children to tell, paying attention, I think noticing changes in children's behaviors and making comments on these changes, letting children know that we notice that there's something not quite right. As I've mentioned, children rarely spontaneously disclose. They need to have opportunities that might be in the form of conversations, possibly stimulated by media, things on the radio, TV. It creates an opportunity for children to have conversations about these issues. Something I was triggered by earlier when someone mentioned something about sharing information and people not talking about their own experiences of abuse. I'm always very struck by children after they disclose, then finding out that maybe their aunt or their uncle or someone they know also had an experience of abuse, but they didn't know this before they disclosed themselves. And I often kind of thought it would be so helpful to children if people were more open about their experiences. And of course, I completely understand why they're not, but it really does help children to be able to identify that they have been sexually abused if they know that it has happened to other people. As I've touched on, that professionals must address their own discomfort in talking about and hearing about abuse. We cannot create opportunities for children to talk about this topic if we're a bit avoidant of it ourselves. That gets communicated to the child. They pick up that information, by our body language, by a tone of voice, and so that will not encourage them to talk about it. So ultimately, the message to the child needs to be, we believe you, we will not be overwhelmed by what you tell us, and we will do something about it. So just a few words about this asking questions. And sometimes, particularly professionals are very anxious about the questions that they might ask children. We all know about the high profile cases where people have asked very leading questions. And obviously in the legal context that we have, we can be crucified for asking the wrong questions of children. Nevertheless, many children actually tell in the context of being asked questions. Not necessarily questions such as, have you been sexually abused? But questions such as, you look very down today. Is there anything bothering you? Or as I mentioned, when there are opportunities of things on the media, oh, I know someone who had an experience like that. Have you ever had an experience like that? Those kinds of very open questions can be very helpful if a child is in need of telling you something. Sometimes children can feel that they should be asked. I've had young people tell me that their parents should have known, that they should have known by their behavior. They should have been able to tell that this had been happening. And in fact, the parents had no idea at all. And it's also, you know, important to appreciate that while children can deny when we ask, that should not stop us asking. And just because children deny it does not mean that this hasn't happened. And of course, we can get it wrong. And there's something about, I think, sexual abuse that makes us very anxious about getting it right and getting it right the first time, and not perhaps giving a little bit of permission to, you know, we can try this, we can try that, we can ask the question. Even if the child reacts very negatively to our question, then we can think about how we might do that better next time round. So the third strategy, sharing concerns about individual children. As I've mentioned, it's just really important to put those pieces together to build that jigsaw picture so that we have a clearer picture perhaps of what might be happening for a child. The importance of professionals in different systems working together for the sake of protecting children, making a note of our concerns. So, you know, keeping records, listening to what a child is trying to communicate, having conversations with each other about individual children. You know, it's like when we pool that information together, it might make a lot more sense, and it gives us support as well. And it may take some time to build up a picture of what's actually going on for the child. The fourth strategy is responding to children's attempts to tell. As I mentioned, children can very often tell in little bite sizes. In my experience, professionals' anxieties about what to do if a child tells them, this was referred to earlier, is really kind of helped if they do have clear policies and procedures. So for those professionals who know what they need to do next, who know who they need to go to, who know very clearly what the next steps are, they're much more comfortable in their own skin in having those conversations with children and being able to receive that information. And there is a skill of open questioning. As I mentioned, you know, again, that anxiety about getting it wrong, what questions to ask, is this a leading question? People might be familiar with Michael Lamb and his colleagues' book, Tell Me About What Happened. And one of those kind of phrases that's used a lot in services such as Sinclair's, where we interview children about the possibility of abuse, is that term, tell me more about that. So it's very much inviting the child to say more. It's not at all leading. It's not, you know, putting words into the child's mouth, but it's giving them a very strong message that we're interested in what they have to say, and they may have more to say. Another idea, I think, is role play exercises. So when people are in a work context where they may be volunteers, they may be employed, and they have other colleagues around, that they could actually pull aside a colleague and say, look, I'm going to talk to this 9-year-old child in the morning. Can I do a little role play with you? Can you pretend to be a 9-year-old child? And I'll just practice this a little bit. And it does give you a little bit of confidence. You'll get a little bit of feedback maybe from your colleague as to say, I don't think you should ask that. I think that was a bit off, or whatever. But just using those little role play exercises to build your confidence. And finally, the child must go away from the conversation with a sense that it was worthwhile telling you whatever it is they were able to tell you. So it is a risk, excuse me, as someone mentioned earlier, they are taking a risk to tell you something. So it's really important that that's in some way reinforced, or they get positive affirmation for that. And a few words, I'll just take us up here. A few words about this topic about believing children. I just thought it might be helpful to throw out these ideas. Children can doubt that it really happened. So they can have their own doubts. And if they're met with doubt, that can keep them quiet for the next 20, 30 years. So sometimes, and it isn't at all unusual that children have this experience of the abuse being a bit surreal. Sometimes it's just important to stay with it and let the child come to that place themselves, but they're constantly met with an acceptance. So you're accepting what they're telling you. Children are often threatened that no one will believe them. They're afraid they won't be believed, and sometimes children are not believed by the people close to them. As adults, we can respond with doubt, moving between believing and not believing, Not that we think the child may not be telling the truth, but it might be quite incredible for us. And particularly for parents that can be so shocked that they can't believe what happened. And it's not that they don't believe the child. So it's just, I find this whole believing thing is a very complicated concept. And I've met so many parents who have kind of struggled with believing that something happened, but not that they doubted their child. We know that the delay in disclosing can undermine credibility. Roland Summit wrote about this way back 1992, about how adults find it difficult to understand that if this really happened to a child, that they could possibly keep this to themselves and that they wouldn't tell about it immediately. But as we know, children are very creative when it comes to keeping secrets, and indeed adults. But unfortunately, that can result in people not believing it because they didn't tell immediately. We also know that children can recant when they're not believed. It can feel easier for the child to just take it back. We know the children can forget they were abused, and that doesn't help in terms of when they perhaps then recall it and tell and disclose it. And then, the question is, well, why didn't you say this before? What do you mean you forgot? How could you forget something like this? And then finally, although it's quite rare, children can tell lies about abuse. And there's usually a very good explanation behind that. And I guess that's why it's important that we have assessment processes, etc. So the fifth strategy, supporting children's and young people's social networks. And this is very much acknowledging that particularly adolescents disclose first to peers, and that good quality peer relationships is a very strong protective factor, both for children's well-being and mental health, but also in terms of responses to disclosure. So friends provide support and they help young people tell an adult. However, they're not always supportive. So lots of research studies have reported on very negative responses from peers. And also to bear in mind that sometimes I think the pressure, I talk about this pressure cooker effect in my research, the pressure that's built up for children in terms of being able to tell a peer, sometimes because they've been able to confide, the pressure is relieved and then they don't tell an adult for some time. In some of my research, young people have told me stories where their friends went and told their parents, sometimes behind their back, because their friends were so concerned about them. And I was struck by how responsible that was of the young people. Very, very difficult to do, but actually they forgave them in the end up and certainly had a good outcome. And the final strategy, promoting children's resilience. In a lot of the research, children talk about, this sense of losing control over what happens when they disclose. And I know this is a very strong feature for adults as well when they're reporting it to child protection services. So there's something about the professional response and the system response in terms of including children, letting them know what's happening, giving them some choices where it's possible, trying to find opportunities where they actually can exert some autonomy, and that not feeding into this, I suppose, dynamic of the child being the victim, and then they're further victimized by a system that doesn't actually treat them as an individual and a human being, but rather as a victim. And of course, important not to make any false promises. And very often the reason that, perhaps information isn't very clear about what's going to happen next is that the professional themselves doesn't know what's going to happen next. And they don't want to give false promises, but sharing information as much as is possible. And then finally, just to finish up, I just wanted to note the challenge for parents. So on the one hand, there's promoting children's resilience and autonomy, but there's also something about, paying attention to the impact on parents. Parents are in an ideal position, obviously, to notice when something is going wrong, and it can be difficult for them to know when and what to ask. Particularly as children get older, they may get a very negative reaction if they ask questions of their teenage sons or daughters. But there's something about persisting with that and trying to find a way of having conversations, even if they're not well received. And particularly with adolescents in terms of negotiating dependence and independence. Some of in my research, some of the young people who had experienced abuse, their parents interpreted them distancing themselves from the parents as part of, teenage years, part of, moving away from them and becoming more independent. In fact, the teenagers were avoiding their parents because they were afraid their parents would notice that there was something wrong. So the more they avoided them, the less likely the parents would be to pick up on something wrong, which was that they had been abused. And then this challenge for parents where, particularly if it's a parent who has abused the child or a partner, the impact of that on the non-offending parent, that this is the person that I'm in a relationship with, that I love, etc., and they did this to my child. Or if there's sibling abuse, so a parent who's really torn between, caring for one child and caring for another and loving both, and how to manage that. And those of you interested, I've written a paper with a colleague, Liz Nixon, on parents' experiences of their child's disclosure that I'd be happy to share if anybody wants to drop me an email. So the take-home messages from today: that child protection is everybody's responsibility. That's very clearly stated in all our policy documents, etc. But that we really can play our part in helping children tell and focusing on the helping them tell rather than the barriers to telling. That we can help create a culture where we ask questions about children's well-being and we create an expectation among children that they tell us when something is wrong. And if I could ask people to reflect on the basis of what I've talked in those about those 6 strategies, what one small change can you make in your practice that you can take away with you today that draws on what you've heard? So Garamila Mahagov, and those are my 2 email addresses if anybody wants to drop me a note to get more information. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosie, and that was fantastic. And I mean, a lot to take away, and great to see so many practical steps that professionals in the audience can actually apply, Monday morning when they go into practice and into their approaches to working with children and adolescents. I'd like to bring Deirdre back in as well for the Q&A, but maybe while she's doing that, I have a couple of pieces for yourself, Rosaline, and if there's any in the chat, please feel free. There's a couple of excellent Rosaline and brilliant in there already. So if anybody wants to post into the chat, we're trying our best to get to those. But you mentioned the importance of interprofessional working, and I'm conscious we're moving towards at least piloting this Barnhouse kind of approach. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and what are the important points we need to bear in mind in terms of interprofessional working in this area? So I'm conscious we have a wide spread of professions in the audience.
I mean, I think unfortunately the way our systems are at the moment in terms of child protection services, health services, mental health services, children's services, etc. It's a challenge to connect the dots, isn't it? It's a challenge because of the way the systems are set up, because perhaps people are employed in different ages, etc. And I'm thinking about, for the last 20 years, any policy document I've ever read in this country has talked about the importance of interagency working and the value of it and how important it is, etc., etc. But it's just really difficult. I think it's really difficult when we're actually employed in different agencies. I mean, the Barnhouse is it's a good idea for kind of that immediate response to a disclosure. I suppose it has come from very much from a forensic foundation, from a forensic basis. Most of my clinical experience has been actually more to do with kind of a, child protection assessment or therapeutic response, rather than necessarily, part of the forensic investigation process, the legal response, let's say.
Yeah.
So I'm not, I think in some countries they have been able to, have a more, I suppose, therapeutically oriented Barnhouse response than in others. I know some countries in Northern Europe, my experience has been that it's been the forensic is what has taken precedence, and that's not always what families want or need. And I think a lot of what we've heard today, that it can be a real challenge to respond, that for the legal system to respond in such a way that is sensitive to the impact of what these individuals have gone through.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And maybe now Deirdre has come back on screen. In your experience in the legal system, Deirdre, you spoke about it in that wider sense, but what are the sticking points? And I'm conscious you're facilitating and supporting adults to engage with the legal system, but What are the key sticking points for you at the moment, and what sort of issues are you advocating on?
I think some of the issues are in relation to training for professionals, and I think everybody touched on that earlier, and there's a real deficit in terms of information around the impact of trauma and how that manifests in the system. And I think that gets thrown back at survivors as, you know, looking like they're not credible or not consistent. And, you know, as Rosaleen said, I think there's always going to be that challenge between, you know, how the legal system responds to something and the therapeutic approach. But I think we can find a balance. And I think as a society, we often default to, well, those issues get sorted out in the courts, or those issues get sorted out by social workers, when actually there is more of a collective responsibility that we all have. And I think the kind of shutdown that people experience when they try to disclose in their own communities or their own families, I think that's one of the issues that we come across all the time. You know, people are often catapulted into the system because, you know, they haven't been believed by people who care or who they're close to, and that often causes more splits and more, you know, more harm. And that's something that we come up against time and time again.
And that's, it's a nice segue back into Rosaleen's work, because you spoke a lot about belief, Rosaleen, and how we manage that. Because there's this sense, you know, from my own experience of my own research and having practiced in social work in this area, of very much tiptoeing around this area of belief and maybe saying you believe or not saying you believe. And it's stark when it gets further up the life course to working with adults through the child protection system. So what is it for you and your experience of working around this area of belief? I'm conscious you flagged this, but maybe if you wanted to say a little bit more about that big concept of belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a very real tension, because of course what concerns people about not saying I believe you is that in some way this will be held against them as a professional, that in some way they will have done something wrong, and in fact even may compromise a legal investigation if they were in some way to say I believe you I mean, I think, you know, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we know the damage that it does when people who have been through experiences like this are not believed. We know from their own mouths the harm that it has caused when they felt that they weren't believed, or when they were, you know, when it was very clearly avoided, that a professional telling them that they believe them. I think one of the things that strikes me, and it always does in a context when we're talking about the kind of legal dangers, if you like, of saying certain things or dealing with things in a particular way. Certainly the last statistics that we have in relation to children and making formal complaints and going through the legal process is that about 10% go that route. So we're talking of the children that we know about who engage with systems for help, for support, about 10% of those will actually end up going through a prosecution process. That's the last data that we have, and perhaps it's changed now. So are we going to design our systems on the basis of a very small cohort of children and families? Is everything going to be designed in such a way to make sure that 10% isn't in some way, or that those processes are not in some way compromised? So as you can hear, I have all these kind of tensions, concerns in terms of best practice. I personally, I would say I don't generally, you know, use the words I believe you. And I think in one of my slides, I use the word accept. I try to give a very strong message that I accept what they're telling me. I accept that this is their experience. You know, it's not about my own personal belief. I'm generally dealing with people in a professional capacity. And you know, the expectation around whether I use the word believe is not generally there in my work. But if I was asked directly by a child, do you believe me? I probably would say, yes, I do believe you, because I think that's just so important for them to hear it.
Yeah, it is a tension, as you say, isn't it? It's probably the best way to describe it. I have a question in here from Clina Sadlier, the RCNI. Given most first disclosures from children are to family, friends, and circles of trust. What can we do to equip the general public to protect the child and their disclosure from accusations, dismissals of leading and coaching?
I think it comes back to awareness, doesn't it? It comes back to educating the public. You know, I suppose in my work in St. Clair's, and I worked in St. Clair's years ago, and then I've been out of it for a long time, and I'm only recently back in the last year. But my sense is that parents are, certainly the parents we meet, I think they're much more aware now than the parents of, like, say, 15 years ago when I worked in the unit before. They are more aware of the importance of listening to children, not being too leading in the questions they ask, recording, you know, taking notes of what the child has said. I mean, you're always going to get, you know, parents who are very anxious. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that our normal conversations with children mean that we do scaffold a lot. We provide a lot of the answers to the questions that we ask them. So the normal conversations we have are very leading. And then when it comes to sexual abuse, we have to talk in a completely different way. So it is really challenging. It's hard for parents to keep that in mind. But I think, sorry, just to go back in terms of the short answer to Cliona, awareness, education, more and more and more. And I think as professionals, anybody working with children, we can use that contact with families to educate. It doesn't have to be a formal education campaign. It can be through our daily work, talking about these kind of issues, talking about best practice.
That's fantastic. And I mean, I see some other questions coming in here, specifically that you might be able to address yourselves in the typing section of the Q&A. And a question that kind of connects to what we've just discussed is something you had mentioned, Rosaleen, earlier on about, you know, we know from the research we have this significant minority of disclosures are between peers and between the children themselves and adolescents at that age. And you talked about one of the responses being responsible and caring. And I'm wondering, is there anything from your own research or from other research you've looked at in that dynamic between peers, receiving and giving disclosure, making disclosure between peers, that we can take away for wider systems? Is there something in the quality of those relationships that we can learn from?
I'll have to think about that now to give that a decent answer. But it prompts me to, I suppose, remind ourselves that I'm certainly very struck by how much teenagers of today carry a very heavy burden as recipients of information that is very distressing. So we have very high rates of mental health difficulties, and we have a lot of peers leaning on their friends for emotional support at times, which, you know, it's and I mean really heavy duty psychological distress, maybe, you know, self-harming, maybe feeling suicidal, and leaning on their friends and how that is for their friends. And so there's kind of, I think there's a very large pool of adolescents out there who are providing support to each other in terms of psychological distress. And I think there's something about adults needing to step in there. I think in some of the stories that I had collected in my research, you know, those heartening stories where children, you know, someone might disclose to a friend, and the friend would go straight to their parent. And so the friend knew that they were not going to be able to carry this, and they went and got the help. They had a good relationship with their parent, or they felt that they could approach their parent. So I think there is something about, you know, in society, adults stepping up to the mark and making sure that our teenage, you know, sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, our wider society are supported in general, and not just those who are experiencing abuse, but also their friends and their friends, and that kind of wider network.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's about those relationships of care and trust and support, whether that be interpersonal or interprofessional, as we're talking about earlier on. I have a question from Dave Hennessy here for anybody, and possibly Deirdre might chip in on this. Is it not time to restructure the Office of the DPP? I'm horrified about the re-victimization, the brave young woman had to keep going through in an attempt, I think that's referring to Hazel's piece earlier on, in an attempt to get justice. There are far too many such cases which only stop victims coming forward to disclose. Question for anyone, but may it be, Deirdre, in your professional experience, you must have and have, I think, by your reports and from talking to you, have seen people put off this system by knowing about other people's experiences of it. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what it's like for somebody who doesn't want to go near the criminal justice system for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the majority of people don't want to go through the criminal justice system for the reason that, and I guess I'm sometimes conscious of even describing it, because I realize in doing that you are ultimately putting people off engaging in something that they are entitled to engage with. And I know things like the Belfast rape trial and other significant cases that have been in the media here and abroad have significantly influenced people's, I have had supported clients with, where they have decided to walk away once, you know, they've heard what happens in court, which is really something I think that society needs to take responsibility for, not just the legal professionals. The office of the DPP, I think that's a difficult one, because there is a degree of independence that must be there that's very difficult for any of us to challenge. But I have seen changes I've been doing this job a long time, and I have seen a lot of changes in recent years. And they now have the victim support unit. So there is, again, increased understanding. It's very slow, but there's increased understanding in terms of the impact. But there is a massive difference between how the law views sexual crime and how society see it and experience it, and how children try to find their way through the criminal justice system. Their needs are never met. The power imbalance is always there, and that's something I think that will be difficult, but there is ways to make it better.
Thanks so much for that, Deirdre, and thank you, Rosaleen, as well. There's other questions in there, and as I say, there's some specific ones that you can address yourselves. You can get into the chat there. I'd like you both, if you can, to stay with us for the final panel. But I'm going to move now to introduce our final speaker and our keynote address for the conference. And I will ask Ramona to switch on our camera and come alive for us. If you're there, please. And let me switch the video around here, and so while Ramona is getting herself set up there, I will introduce. So we were really delighted. Ramona had actually, we put it in place that Ramona was going to attend in person for this event when it was originally planned for back in August, but unfortunately we were all under strict instructions not to be gathering and all the rest for reasons obvious to us all now. So we were hoping to have everybody present in the one spot, and you know, the coffee breaks and the lunch breaks and the comings and goings at these types of events are huge informal learning and networks. So unfortunately we haven't had that capability. We also haven't been able to respond to all of the questions that are coming in on the chat, unfortunately. But we are trying, and the individual speakers are trying to address those also. So as a result of this, hopefully what we'll see as a starting point on this conversation, I am trying to get a network of people, interested parties, whether they be stakeholders in the professions or researchers, to kind of stay together and stay linked in over the course of the next couple of years at least, on an interim basis to kind of see how we can progress this, or see if there's any network or any sort of coherent point that we can bring together. And I think there have been a number from the speakers already. So I'll be reaching out to people on that and opening that up for people to take part in essentially a formal research network or a professional network to stay involved in these issues, to keep the discussion going. But in relation to Ramona, I'm conscious, Ramona, I hope you can get on camera there. Yes, we're there. Thank you very much. So I'm delighted to welcome Ramona. Ramona couldn't join us earlier on because it was, as I say, 4:30 in the morning in Toronto, but she is here now. towards the end of our day, and we're delighted to have her on board. So Ramona Elijah is Professor of at the Factor Intuash Faculty of Social Work, and it is affiliated with the Women and Gender Studies Institute. She's a former Factor Intuash Chair in Children's Mental Health, and Ramona is currently the Margaret and Wallace McCain Family Chair in Child and Family. Ramona's overarching area of research is the interest in trauma and resilience across the life course, and her research focus on gender and violence, child sexual abuse disclosure and mental health effects, intimate partner violence and structural barriers, and promoting ways to foster resilience processes in child, youth and adults exposed to violence. Results of these studies aid in mitigating the long-term effects of trauma, violence and abuse on children and youth, and she strongly advocates for the use of trauma-informed approaches in service delivery. So I think you'll agree in just that introduction, it is a lovely way to sort of seal off our discussions today and maybe point us towards future topics that we can look at in this area. So Ramona, I'm delighted you're here, and I will let you take it away. You're very welcome, and thank you for giving us your time today.
Thank you very much, Joe. I am so honored to be here, speaking amongst the presence of all those who have had the lived experience, who have worked with survivors, and who continue to do this brave work. This is, a really hard act to follow. I was able to join for half the day, and I'm really, really moved. So thank you for having me. I just wanted to start by saying that I am from the University of Toronto in Canada. So my experience is in the Canadian context. I want to frame it that way so that perhaps we can learn from each other in this knowledge exchange. Certainly I have so much just from the talks that I've seen today, and have made notes about the things that I want to take away and bring into my network. So today I'm going to speak about disclosing and responding to child sexual abuse. How far have we come, and ways forward, hopefully. The work I started in Toronto in this area was as a practitioner in children's mental health for quite a number of years, about 15 years, working specifically in child trauma and sexual trauma, and finding that there really wasn't a lot to guide our work. And I'm hearkening back to a time, sort of the late 80s, early 90s, where in Canada we discovered child sexual abuse, so to speak. And of course, we've known it's been around for centuries, but we suddenly came into this awareness. And I found, as a clinical director of a children's mental health center and focusing on prevention and treatment of child sexual abuse, that there really wasn't much for out there research to guide our practice. And so I did what some people do, is went back to school and got a PhD, and really then wanted to move forward to really find ways to help research inform a better way of doing practice with survivors. Unfortunately, so often the act of speaking out makes you alone. That holds so true for children, for youth, for adults, in areas and speaking about things that society doesn't want to hear about. I also more recently have embarked on a research project with a partner in Quebec, Delphine Collin-Vizina, looking at the impact of the Me Too movement on sexual violence disclosures in Canada, which so far has resulted in a paper. If you're interested, it's on open access. I never told until the Me Too movement and what we can learn from sexual violence disclosures on social media. I'll talk a little bit about that. And we're in the process of interviewing and doing case analyses, interviewing sexual violence survivors, service providers, activists, and allies. And as I said, looking at legal case analyses, and I'll bring those two together later on as we talk about how they're interconnected and disconnected. During this unprecedented time of a pandemic of COVID-19, I have to say that my research really took a bit of a nosedive in terms of being able to collect data, to forge ahead, and I decided, rather than kind of fight this current of people needing to pivot in different ways that that we all did and have still, that I would indulge myself, and it's sort of a funny term to say, indulge myself, to do some deep reflection and thinking about my work in child sexual abuse disclosure, of which I've been doing for almost 2 decades now, and to kind of step back and rise above a little bit to kind of take an overview or an umbrella perspective of, you know, how far have we come and where we may need to move to. And I dove into looking at the studies around, you know, just how big of a problem is child sexual abuse. And I've come, you know, and this is not a new conclusion. I've written about this. Folks who've been speaking at the seminar have spoken about this. And it's not surprising to find that the majority of child sexual abuse disclosures are delayed until childhood, until adulthood. So let me just talk a little bit about the difference between incidence rates and prevalence rates. After all, I'm a researcher now, and we kind of need to see what the backdrop is of these issues. And so in North America anyway, we have seen that the incidence rates of child sexual abuse have declined significantly, and some studies are reporting less than 10% of children presenting in our child welfare system, which is a particular brand of child welfare and similar to other systems in North America, that incidence studies really take the rate of the reported and then actual substantiations of child sexual abuse investigations in a time frame, usually a year, and then perhaps they accumulate that over 5 years. And so, you know, the data really relies on child welfare or police reports at the time of disclosure. And so how do we kind of interpret what's happening here? And there've been theories over the last decade that have been put forward that perhaps actually things are getting better and there's less incident of child sexual abuse, and perhaps prevention programs are working and other structural changes in society are working, and that we're actually seeing less child sexual abuse. However, there are also theories that this has gone underground and that reporting isn't happening at the same rate, when in fact sexual abuse is probably occurring at the same rates. But there's something else going on. Perhaps this is now in cyberspace, that this is online exploitation and sexual abuse that's occurring, and that's harder to detect. So there are theories that are going around, but in this period of sort of deep reflection and thinking that I've been doing, I looked at the probably 30 plus prevalence studies over the last 4 decades. And prevalence is exactly what we're talking about today in many ways. These are retrospective cases of child sexual abuse. These are retrospective accounts. This is when adults respond to surveys or interviews or whatever to say that this has happened to them in the past. And so they're called retrospective studies, and they say there are problems with this. There are, you know, perhaps memory issues around this or whatever. But what I found really interesting is that these prevalence rates of past sexual abuse have remained relatively stable over the last 4 decades. There is a slight decrease around 2000, 2001, but overall, when we look at this cumulatively, we're still seeing 24% of females report past sexual abuse. And I'm focusing on females because these studies are mostly of females. An understudied area, of course, is in male child sexual abuse, an area that I've been interested in. But we're still remaining at that 1 in 4, and probably for boys, 1 in 6. And so how is it that the incidence rates are dropping, but the prevalence rates are staying the same? And so I think that's when we really have to look to the environment. And this could be a very disturbing statistic of incident rates decreasing, because it may mean that our environments have been become less open to hearing about child sexual abuse, less equipped to actually respond to child sexual abuse. So what happens then is that you get a percentage coming forward in terms of sort of the capacity that can be handled. And so my focus in this talk today is really about how the environment is playing into encouraging disclosures and or effectively responding to child sexual abuse disclosures. We know that the act of telling is a difficult path, as so many of you mentioned, and I think, you know, Rosaline, who I work with, said it eloquently, that, you know, it is a difficult path. That disclosure is not a static event. It's not a one-off kind of spontaneous, perfectly full disclosure at one sitting. That's very rare. And it's a process that occurs over time, with survivors constantly kind of scanning and monitoring their environment, constantly thinking about whether to tell or not to tell, to who, when, in what ways. It's a really measured process. It's labored, it's back and forth, because the risks are so high. When I heard I think Rosaline speaking about how therapists weigh up that risk in their head, should I ask this question in this way? Is it going to have an impact on the court proceeding or a legal case? If I say I believe, is that leading? Is that going to contaminate the legal case going forward? And that is, I found, just really mirrors the lived experience of survivors as they think about weighing up the risks about telling or not telling, what will happen, what will not happen. So it's interesting that as professionals, we kind of mirror the same dilemmas that are happening for our clients. We also know that disclosure is a lifelong process. And again, that just goes to show you that when we see that, and the best estimates are about 80% of survivors withhold or delay disclosure till adulthood, it's not surprising that it's a life process. And we have some really good models to understand this and to frame our work. Stoller and Nelson Gardell's disclosure description process, McIlvaney's, Green's, and Hogan's Containing the Secret, their formulation of how this difficult path might unfold. And then in my own work of many ways of telling and taking a life course lens. And most of my research has been with adult survivors retrospectively telling their stories of what happened to them. In a recent review that I did with my McGill University partner, Delphine Colin Vizina in Montreal, we found that there were specific disclosure trends. We looked at, again, about 30 plus scientific studies, and we saw some distinct disclosure trends. Disclosures increase with age. That's why we see so many withholding, delaying until adulthood. Boys are less likely to disclose, as we heard from Mick, that the shame that comes with being a boy and being victimized and sexually victimized comes with additional aspects to disclosure. Adolescent females are less likely to be believed and more likely to be blamed. Disclosures are more likely when the perpetrator is not in close proximity to the victim. So again, victim survivor, again, as the child grows up and becomes an adult, or as an adult and the perpetrator they may be able to get away from, it becomes an opening and an opportunity to be able to disclose. We also found that families with open communication and social supports increase the likelihood of earlier disclosures by children. Prevention programs can prompt disclosures. And we saw this in the research that we looked at and the studies that we examined. And more school settings are becoming central sites of disclosure. And as mentioned before, telling peers is much more common now. With the studies that we looked at, from the period of time that we looked at, I think it was from 2000 to 2016, the social media aspect hadn't quite come into those studies, and I'll talk about that later. So I would say that's another disclosure trend. But here's one that I want us to really take a look at. In a few of the American studies, over 50% of young children denied sexual abuse in forensic interviews, even when there is unrefutable evidence, such as that they had a sexually transmitted infection. I just want to hang on to that for a moment. And we're not going to spend time looking at forensic interviewing. We're sort of dealing with another kind of area of responding to child sexual abuse disclosures. But if you want to look at a model for an established interview method for child sexual abuse disclosures, the National Institute of Child and Human Development has developed a protocol that's based on best practices and evidence-based methodology. And they in particular focus on the accommodations or the modifications that need to be made with young and very young children. So they have some really good guidelines in there, but it is framed and contained within a more rigid structure of forensic interviewing, which we've heard has had its limitations. But one of the things that we wanted to do is to understand better in terms of looking back at this, these two sort of major findings around incidents of child sexual abuse and prevalence, that my group and team with McGill University and with Rosaline McIlvany, who was part of that, we were able to develop a study to interview youth who had very recently gone through a disclosure and a process in response to that disclosure. And so we had a number of sites in Toronto, in Montreal, and then in Dublin, of course. And we wanted to, using a very specific interview guide, try to understand the process of a younger cohort. And we looked at doing in-depth interviewing of 14 to 24-year-olds. We were able to, over a period of time, do in-depth interviewing with 38 youth. So that we could get a fuller range of developmental influences. And we did find that our mean age was around 18. One of our participants turned 25 before the end of the study. And what we found in that so far, and we've just wrapped it up, and we're starting to write some papers for publication, is that was not the 4 years for delay was average in disclosing child sexual abuse, but it could range anywhere from 1 to 8 years with the youth that we interviewed. They cited reasons that they did not want to tell, or they did not know how to tell. Maybe they didn't have language, or that they did not know that there was anything to tell because the abuse occurred at such young developmental ages that the ability to reason, the cognitive capacity, and linguistic capacity is just not there. It wasn't until they became older that they reflected and realized that something had happened that was a crime. In the course of this study, many aspects came out. And one of them was around the ways that youth tell. And it caused me to reflect back on my original model of disclosure and many ways of telling, and starting to revisit that with these new data, because the sort of average age of participants in the original project that resulted in many ways of telling was closer to 40, between 38 and 40. So it didn't necessarily capture in a more here and now way the experiences of younger folk. As a reminder, in the original model, I was able to define 5 ways that we could expect disclosures to come forward. Those are purposeful, accidental, behavioral, elicited, prompted, or triggered. And you can, I can send you that paper, or you can find it. I'm not sure if it's on open access, but we sort of started that as a starting point, as one aspect of this large project. And through the interview data, we were able to start to develop new categories that the youth were telling us about. And these are, and I'll just go over them in the next slides, and with some quotes as data. And we started to see other categories we should be considering. And one of them was incremental disclosure. And youth were telling us in particular, one said, I started by saying, what if someone was putting them outside of themselves? Or might have started saying, I just said something bad was happening, not what it was, and it took a really long time to say what it was. That we also saw this inadvertent disclosure where perhaps the person didn't intend to disclose, but in this case, a young boy said I asked my sister if she thought grandpa was gay, and she asked why. And I said, because he was showing me gay men having sex on the computer. She went and told her parents. We also have information-based, precipitated-based, such as prevention programs in schools. And I really have a hard time even saying prevention programs, because they really put the onus on victim survivors to defend and protect themselves and tell somebody. So I say that with a little bit of a cynicism. But some disclosures, they said, were precipitated by going to a workshop at school, or a talk in their auditorium, or they got their information online. So we start to see more of this sort of online cyber aspect of disclosures, or at least getting information. And I have to say this is a double-edged sword, because some of the information they got online scared them and cause them not to disclose, because in Canada, or at least in Ontario, we have a duty to report, and that would come through in these this information online. And then there's unintentional partial disclosures. Again, I think this has been mentioned, where somebody told a best friend, a peer, and that person went and told somebody else, a parent, and it set off a chain of events that they felt really out of control of. I want to just say a note before I get to this later on that I really want to emphasize. I think we really have to take a long, hard look at our profession, our society, and our way of increasing knowledge around child sexual abuse, about providing these awareness programs, and especially in schools, where we are encouraging kids to tell, to disclose. Yet at the same time, the responses are not there. The legal system has not caught up. So we are prompting, encouraging, saying you're going to be a brave person if you tell, and you have to tell an adult. And yet we don't provide anything at the other end once they do. Oh yes, we could have some very sensitively trained professionals for the initial disclosure, but and perhaps child advocacy centers. We have a large one in Toronto, where there is a sensitive, child-friendly response and investigation, but not always. Sometimes that depends. And then there's this sort of vast void of anything can happen. Usually it's quite negative, and that ends up being in the judicial system. But I want us to think what a dilemma we're creating when we push and focus on these positive disclosure programs, prevention programs, awareness programs, you must tell programs, and then we are not responsible and accountable for what happens at the other end. I'm not saying we personally, each person, but as a society, I think there is something that we need to examine there very closely. We also were able to identify disclosure precipitators, why these youth in this particular study were saying they actually did disclose, because many of them did delay. And we can see from the list here that this is not surprising. Some of the, they couldn't take it anymore. Fear of pregnancy, finally really realizing the abuse was not normal, that was a crime, that symptoms perhaps got to the point where they were very concerned. Their decreased school performance and so on, and this online and social media usage is now playing a role in some disclosures. Now that we've got a bit of the lay of the land, what is the way forward? What can we be doing to remedy this situation, to encourage, facilitate, and respond to disclosures in humane ways? My simple answer is, if we see that prevalence rates are stable, are staying fairly static, 1 in 4, yet the incidence rates are coming down, and we're not sure why, we got to take a look at the environment and the sort of, common sense responses that we need to really be creating trauma-informed environments. And as a reminder, we want certain aspects to come through in these environments. Safety within relationships, building trust. And this safety and trust is a difficult dance when there is a mandatory duty to report. So that everything a child, a youth, or might tell us about a sexual trauma committed by an adult kind of goes out the window when at the same time we're saying, but we will have to tell other people this won't be confidential. And I know you're worried about your family imploding or getting people in trouble or feeling that you'll be in, but we still have to go and tell not only, you know, somebody, the authorities, but in what we call in Toronto, the Children's Aid Society, which comes with, when you say that word, the CAS, a lot of fear and high risk feelings. Choice and control, once we've informed limits of confidentiality, that's also up for debate, whether how much choice and control a survivor has at that point. We do have an adult disclosure house called the Gatehouse in Toronto, in which adults can safely disclose. And I know they're using this particular model to, or at least, you know, trauma-informed care model. And their issues are a bit different, where they can actually ensure more of that choice and control, collaboration, and empowerment. But it is a difficult dance with children and youth. And, you know, an example of that would be one of the things I've learned not to say and do help in trainings is, you know, you can tell me and everything's going to be all right, because that's hardly going to be the case. We cannot say that everything's going to be all right. There will be a chain of events that will unfold over which many of these principles will be compromised. Safety, trust, choice, and control, for sure. So what helps to tell? Let's get to some of the, you know, ways to move forward. We know that disclosures are more likely to occur in a dialogical context, in a trusting relationship, and that can be a formal helping relationship or informal supports. We know that disclosure is a process, so time is an important element, and taking time. As I mentioned, a close relationship with mother and open communication in families are facilitators to disclosing. And disclosures increase when perpetrators are no longer in close proximity to the survivors. Providing information and education on topics and sexuality in general is so important, and giving children and youth the language to describe, to have that discussion and those ongoing discussions. And these need to be sexual abuse specific, not just sex ed in general. And of course, this raising awareness and prevention programs, they do prompt disclosures. But as I mentioned before, what happens after that is really kind of uncontained and out of control in terms of what we can promise and deliver to survivors. Some examples of what we're doing in Ontario is sort of like targeted areas of sexual abuse. We're having a terrible problem in Toronto in particular, but other large urban centers in Canada around sex exploitation and human trafficking. It's especially increased during the pandemic because youth are spending more time online, which is a place of recruitment, but also youth are just generally more vulnerable to being exploited, given the isolation and the increased vulnerabilities that occur during a pandemic. And so our provincial government has actually mandated schools to provide anti-human trafficking, sex exploitation training and protocols to all teachers, staff, and then as well educating students who may be at risk or vulnerable to being recruited and trafficked. So that's a good example. We're surprised that this has actually happened. We know that in our networks we've been asking for this, and usually we have to wait another decade before anything happens. And in this case, I think, and probably because of the pandemic and the explosion of numbers of youth being trafficked, that this has become an imperative. And the latest studies show us in Ontario that the average age of a youth being trafficked for sex is 13. We have some great gender-based violence prevention programs. We work with the Child Advocacy Center in Toronto called Boost, and out of that they run Pep Talk, a gender-based violence prevention program in schools in Toronto for grades 7 and 8 students, and we're trying to bring that down to starting as early as grade 3. We have one of our outerlying regions, Victim Services, Durham Victim Services, running a program on Say No More, and they're really targeting residential treatment centers, group homes where the most vulnerable youth reside, but also schools and general areas where we know recruiting happens. There was a policy that was put in place in Ontario that all hotels, motels, and anybody renting rooms who suspect human trafficking is happening in their place of business are to report that. So that really affected the urban centers where reporting increased. So instead the traffickers moved outside into the more suburban and rural areas where it's less likely to be detected in those smaller kinds of motels and hotels. So it really is a growing problem that the province is trying to deal with. So kudos to them. And of course, we have the therapeutic environments that we've talked about in Europe, the Barnahus, and here in Canada, we talk about that in the child and youth centers, advocacy centers. So what are some of these trauma-informed conditions? So our participants, and backed by other research, tell us that having school counselors around and constantly around in school settings are so important. Many of the participants we spoke to disclosed to a teacher or guidance counselor. Knowing the limits of confidentiality, don't make promises you can't keep. Again, the youth said, give breaks in telling the story, reduce the number of times in telling the abuse story. Don't take our victim statements right away in one sitting. We need to process. Screens and closed circuit TVs really help in court, and therapy dogs now as well. Safe houses, as I mentioned, through child advocacy centers, and having, they're so creative, having a group of youth survivors telling professionals how to interview. And I thought that would be a very interesting way to do training. And again, from the youth, train defense lawyers to tell them we're kids and we're scared, because some of the tactics used by defense lawyers in court re-traumatize the already traumatized youth. And so in a recent publication that's coming out soon, I wrote about 10 ways to respond to disclosure. And this can go for any kind of disclosures, gender-based, any kind of gender-based violence, but it also in particular to sexual abuse disclosures. So we want trauma-informed engagement where safety and trust are built into the core of that engagement, that therapeutic alliance. The validation that it's not easy to speak about this, and how hard it is to come forward and speak about the abuse and the violence. Being really clear about those limits of confidentiality, and as I said, don't make promises you can't keep. Engaging in this active listening, and it may kind of address this issue around what Rosaline mentioned in terms of active listening is just really being there and really being present and letting that person, the survivor, tell their story, their narrative, with more nonverbal prompts and encouragers to go on. But I do say that in my model, and you'll see it when it comes out, in terms of response, that I do say that you need to be clear that you do believe and start from a position of believing. Also providing culturally safe and culturally sensitive responses is really important. And that came out in our data as well in the Breaking the Silence project, or Speaking Out, Youth Speaking Out project. That culture and religion played a lot into what our participants told us in a certain aspect, a certain part of our sample. You know, the taboo about speaking about sex, the idea that a sexually violated girl will never be able to successfully marry or have a family. She's been tainted or contaminated. All those discourses ran through their heads as they thought about disclosing and whether they should, and weighing up the risks, the benefits, the threats, the safety. And this was certainly culturally bound as well. Taking a non-judgmental stance. So again, those words can sometimes jump to your brain and hopefully not come out of your mouth, that you really, really think about this, but you know, conveying any kind of disbelief. Are you sure they weren't, they didn't mean to do that? Or are you exaggerating? Or how come you didn't say something sooner? So all those kind of comments really would cause anybody who had a difficult disclosure to make to back off. So scanning this environment, and our respondents also told us that they might try it with somebody, and if they didn't get the response they wanted, they would like retreat, go away, and look for somebody else. We're waiting for these kinds of responses. Conveying that the violence is, you know, never the fault of the survivor, and this believing, empathizing, and normalizing the survivor's reaction to the violence. Supporting the survivor to, sorry, I'm just having a problem, to have control over their disclosure, what to disclose and how much to disclose. So in a way, telling them about, here in my context, that I would have a duty to report to the Children's Aid Society, at least gives them that measure of control about what they might say and not say, what they would edit. But at least they have some control, knowing that if they said something, it would set off a chain of events that I might have described to them or told them about before, so that they're aware. And when they make that choice to go further in the disclosure, they're aware that this will happen. And then providing survivors with information and resources in a safe manner. And I just wanted to end with some final words from our youth. And again, they were so great at giving advice. And we also asked them, so, you know, what would you say to others who are considering disclosing? And overall, we had more positive, a lot more positive responses than, after hearing all this, I expected they'd say, no, I'd never do it again. Nobody should ever do it. But in fact, we heard things like, it's better to tell than to hold it in. Don't think about it twice. If your gut tells you you have to do it, just do it. I like this one. It's like puking. You feel terrible when you're doing it and before, but after you feel fine. It's hard, but it's better to tell. Tell, you'll feel better, even though it's hard. So I think I've reached the end of my time. I'd like to say so much more. I also really experienced the portions of today that I viewed and listened to as so rich and so inspiring, thought-provoking, and encouraging overall. So I'll just end it there. If you want me to send you anything in terms of some of the publications I've mentioned, I have my contact details there. Thank you very much, Joe, for putting us all together and for allowing me this time to share my deep reflections and thinking as I move forward through the pandemic and onto more of this research.
Absolutely. No, listen, thank you so much, Ramona. That was excellent. And it gives us just, I was again jotting notes here, and it touched on everything we've discussed today, and kind of really neatly, I think people will agree, brought it all together in a positive sense of where we can go with this and what steps we can take. I see echoes of what we discussed earlier around this tension between legality and the person, and trying to hold both in tandem when responding to these issues. In that, then this huge importance of individuality and acknowledgement of the individual in whatever sense, whether it's a service or responding. And again, echoing a piece that Mick contributed earlier on. Mick unfortunately had to leave us, of co-creation, of listening, but not only listening, but having the input and having that active engagement and collaboration when we're developing ways forward. I was really interested to hear that, you know, young people and adolescents speaking to the police service to say, this is how we want to be interviewed, and these are the types of things you need to be considering. I think that type of basic level co-creation, real practical co-creation, is something that maybe we need to go to first before we start talking about what policies and laws need to change. The issue of belief has come up from start to finish today. And as Rosaline nicely put it, that difficult tension around belief. And one thing that I'm promoting in my own work as well, which you hit on at the end there, or just before the end, was this kind of sense of encouraging without having the facilitation and support can lead to harm. And we need to have an all-of-system approach. And again, we've had some speakers talking about really good professional responses, but then that stops and that ends, and you're out on your own then after that. So this continuity of care, as we talk about it in other settings, I think is so important, and it really comes from your presentation today. You said you could go on for ages, and I know you have other work, and I want to bring us right back to the start. There are questions coming in, but you spoke about the environment, that this prevalence and incidence discrepancy that we're looking at the moment. And we're at a bit of a delay here in Ireland. We have our SAVI report, our Sexual Abuse and Violence in Ireland report from the early 2000s, and we're working on updating that, and I really hope that's getting up and running now soon. And the plan, I believe, is that we're going to rerun this at intervals. So we don't have it mapped here, but I would imagine we're looking at similar trends. And you spoke about the environment potentially being important here, and maybe are things moving online. So you've done some work on the social media aspect. I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about that dynamic of disclosure and social media?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked me about that, because I'm so interested in this, because I think as humans, we get really creative when we're in dilemmas. And I think that the explosion of, so the Me Too movement's actually been around since 2006. Tarana Burke, a Black activist in the States, developed this movement, or a way for survivors of sexual violence to be able to find community and talk to each other when others were not responding, and especially legal systems. Once in 2017, it hit the social media and became #MeToo. People started using this as a disclosure venue. And if you read my article, there's really a lot of sort of cathartic and moving posts in there of people saying, basically, you know what, I know I'm not going to get justice, but I want my story out there anyway. And I know I'm going to be blamed, disbelieved, minimized, but I know I have a community here that's going to understand, because of course, then all the posts come in and it's huge. There's millions. I stopped counting after a while. When I wrote that article 2 years ago now, there were like 4 million posts that day that I just happened to submit it. It's like, in the tens of millions. People want to find community, they find support from each other then. And so I think we're seeing a lot more of, I know we're not going to get justice in the legal system, but I'm going to get community and belief and support from this venue. Now here where we're having some issues too is that there are social media disclosures then that kids get a hold of about their friends and so forth and so on. So there we see again that kind of disclosure that happens in a way that actions may be taken that weren't expected because there was this community that wouldn't they just wanted to speak and put their voice out there on. I think we're going to see a lot more of this. I think that it's a safe place. It's a safe place to talk about hard things. The problem is there isn't follow-up, and whether if people need therapeutic intervention after that, after disclosing on social media, what do they do then? That's what we don't know. But they found some community, and more in Canada. Survivors are not going through the legal system, legal processes here. They are moving more to civil suits. We had a case of a celebrity broadcaster with the CBCs who was very, very popular. He was charged with sexual assault in the workplace by I think nine women, and it was just dismal, the legal proceedings. The Crown wasn't prepared. There was social media stuff that they didn't know how to handle, and it made the survivors look like liars and that they were conspiring to get this guy, which was not the case at all. He had done some horrendous things, and so he was acquitted. We also noticed that Bill Cosby managed to get out of jail too after everything that happened. So I totally agree with Hazel. Like it's happening everywhere internationally. So what one of the survivors did was go through a civil suit with the Giangameshi, and actually won, and had a very smart lawyer who extracted an apology from him. So people are using this other route. So when the legal route doesn't work, or when the disclosure to authorities doesn't work, people find other ways: social media, civil suits, that kind of thing. And what came out of the Giangameshi case as to why he was acquitted is that we really need trauma-informed courts. We need trauma-informed lawyers. And we're just starting to do that in Ontario, though it's very hard to get judges and lawyers to come in for training. But if they'd had that trauma-informed lens, those survivors would not have had to go through what they went through.
Yeah, I think that's a core point. And I think one of the other, so many themes coming out of today, but one of the other key points today is there isn't an aspect or an area of the system that won't benefit from having this trauma-informed lens. There isn't, from that personal interaction within your own relationships to the high-level drafting of legislation. We need this running through from the person right up to the top and right back down, so that they're experiencing this at all levels, and it really comes through from your work as well. So you say you're starting kind of looking at that now in Canada, and one of the things I mentioned earlier on, and was hoping you'd flag it, because I didn't have the right name for it, and I've only come across it myself, was this gatehouse for adults coming forward to disclose, and maybe if you can say a little bit about that from what you know of it. And I might ask, while you're doing that, for the rest of our speakers that are left with us to come off camera and maybe chime in as well for the last couple of minutes before I wrap up. So maybe if you can tell us a little bit about that, or other developments.
Yes. The gatehouse is near and dear to my heart. In the 1990s, there was a terrible sex abuse ring at one of our most famous hockey arenas. I don't know if you know the Maple Leafs. If you're Canadian, everybody knows the Leafs. They lose all the time. But the Toronto Maple Leafs, but they had this kind of celebrity status arena in the heart of Toronto, and a sex ring started operating out there. The people who worked there and lured boys in. And after about a decade, when they'd grown up, they came forward as a group and made a disclosure. So it's called the Maple Leafs Garden Scandal, and it went through a court process too that just really re-traumatized these young men. And so the lead, Martin Cruz, who had tried to disclose a number of times in hospitals, in mental health clinics, was not believed, was then died by suicide. And so the Gatehouse was the tribute to Martin Cruz to be able to disclose safely, because of what happened to these young men from a very early age was so traumatic, and it was so devastating. And so the Gatehouse was in honor of these men, and it was the therapist who worked with them who started the Gatehouse and found the funding for it, so that this would never happen again.
No, it's really interesting. I'd love to look a little bit more at how it's working and how it's integrated into other systems, and
yeah, it's really quite. It was probably trauma informed before we knew what trauma informed was. Do you know what I mean? Like, we now know Harrison Follett's framework and everything. But when I look back at what they started in the early 90s at the Gatehouse, I realized they were already had internalized this themselves. And it's a very user-friendly house. It's on beautiful grounds. It's a really nice, safe and serene place.
Thank you very much. And Ramona, I want to thank you first, but I want to hold you there for a moment. I want to sincerely thank you for your presentation. I think, as I said, it has brought all the themes from today succinctly to a conclusion. I won't say a close, because I'm hoping here in Ireland, at least, we will continue this conversation around what's going to facilitate and encourage and support people to come forward. I want to, for who's remaining, any final comments from our panel that are left before I do some thank yous and wrap up?
Yeah, I think the biggest thank you, Joe, needs to go to you. You've done a fantastic job of pulling together so many of us from different backgrounds, different areas of expertise and experience, providing a platform for new research to be discussed. And networking. I know that you've lamented a few times that we're not doing this in real life, but we've been networking with each other behind the scenes and in the Q&A. So that's been happening, and you've facilitated that. So thank you. And to acknowledge the amount of hard work and effort that goes in behind the scenes to making sure that these things run as effectively and efficiently as today's did. So, as I said in the comments, I hope there's a glass of lemonade for you somewhere, because you've definitely earned it.
Thanks so much, Hazel. Thanks for that. Anybody else have any comments on today? Or yes, Marilyn.
Thank you to you too. I thought it was an amazing day, and it's incredible how you've just pulled this incredible community together, and thank you to all the speakers. I've just got so much food for thought, and the kind of positive thought that I'll walk away from with is that there are more ways to feel hurt and met than the court system. And maybe if we don't get justice, we can still trust in the ripple effect. And I think the ripple effect today has been working very well. And that in itself, I find a very healing thought. And it wouldn't happen with a strong community at its heart. So thank you for pulling us all together.
Thank you. And it is the strong community that's here. And I think the engagement online and offline today has been very heartening, and is a testament to the community and to people providing their work today and sharing their work. So I just want to thank you all for that. I'm conscious it's Friday evening here and people are finishing up, and I do want to finish on time. So I have a couple of thank yous for those who are left in the audience. We have got to 300 throughout the whole day, so that's amazing. When I started here in UCD, I had a little whiteboard here, and I just put up some things I wanted to do over the next couple of years when I was here. And the first on that list was the disclosure seminar, so I can tick that off now. But hopefully it's the first of many, and maybe we can look at replicating this and looking at specific issues. We covered a huge amount today, and I'm conscious we could have standalone seminars, day-long seminars on any one of these individual issues, from co-creation to belief to encouraging to the tensions between the legalities and the individual. So maybe I'll get back to you all, and maybe we'll look at doing this again on something a little bit more specific. Added to that, there's a huge amount of questions in here. There's 103 standing on the pad here. I haven't been able to get to them because I am coordinating as well. And on that, I want to say a massive thank you to Fiacre for giving over his day to help out behind the scenes as well. And I bit off more than I could chew, and Fiacre was there to rescue. And he called and said, "I'm putting my day aside, so whatever you need." And it was the hug I needed going into this. So thank you, Fiacre, for that. I couldn't have done it without you. I'm also, I suppose, I'm really grateful to the attendants and the people who have joined us today. We have just over 850 registered, so people who will watch this back and engage with the materials. And we had a peak of 500 and a consistent 300 with us throughout the day. So I'm really delighted with that. I want to thank Carol, Jennifer, Neha, Michelle, Marilyn, Mick, Hazel, Rosaline, Deirdre, and of course our keynote, Ramona, for your contributions today. I want to thank 1 in 4 and the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre and the Rape Crisis Network Ireland for linking in with me and supporting me on the research that I've just launched. And in connection with that, then I really sincerely want to thank the Irish Research Council and UCD Seed Funding as well for funding that. I particularly wanted to thank the participants of that study that was launched today. And just to remind everybody, the video will be available in the coming week or so. The resources will be made available as well. And for any of the speakers who wish to share resources, you can get in touch with me. As I said, I'm conscious I haven't got to all the questions. I'm going to pay attention to them. I will get a list of those from Zoom, hopefully. And I hope we do this all again. There's a lot to digest. I sincerely just want to thank you all. And I want to wish you a good weekend and wish all our audience out there a good weekend as well. Thanks very much, everybody. Take care.